Chapter 1902. Words couldn't describe the wonderful taste, and she couldn't control her body's reaction. Georgina felt as if she had completely fallen into the mapo tofu. Her body and mind couldn't resist it at all. At this moment, it became the most wonderful catalyst. Yes, she couldn't help but want to cater to its deliciousness. She couldn't resist. This was different from any food she had eaten in the past. That distinct taste and unique texture crushed all of the delicacies in her memory. The pure numbing taste was refreshing. After the spiciness was mixed with the scalding tofu, it brought about an even stronger impact. That impact was something that no food could give her. The thin crack in her heart was forcefully torn open at this moment, allowing an even brighter light to shine in. She seemed to see a small alley vaguely. It was a narrow and crowded alley, but the alley was filled with all kinds of food stalls. People were wandering between the stalls, tasting all kinds of food. And in the crowd, she even saw a gentle woman holding the hand of a little girl in red. She was elegantly eating with the little girl, and a gentle smile was on her face the entire time. After swallowing a mouthful of mapo tofu, Georgina's forehead was already covered in sweat, and tears were glistening in the corners of her eyes. "Are you all right?" Harrison asked with concern. I'm just a little burned by the spiciness." Georgina avoided Harrison's gaze. The spicy tofu slid down her throat and turned into a warm current that spread throughout her body. Only then did the spiciness really start to show. Georgina hurriedly lowered her head and ate a mouthful of rice. The soft rice had a pleasant fragrance, and the more she chewed, the sweeter and sweeter it became. It perfectly suppressed the spiciness of the mapo tofu. "This rice is delicious too." Georgina looked at the rice in front of her with disbelief. The grains were more slender than the ones she usually ate, and the grains were even and crystal clear. After swallowing a mouthful of rice, she couldn't help but stare at the mapo tofu. The spiciness was addictive, and it made people unable to stop. "I'll just eat one more mouthful. One last mouthful." Georgina stared at the mapo tofu and prepared herself mentally. Then, she picked up the spoon and scooped another spoonful of tofu. This time, she didn't rush to put it into her mouth. She carefully blew on it for a while, and then she was still burned. Sometimes, burning the mouth was also a happy thing. The delicious taste danced on the tip of her tongue. Georgina closed her eyes, and a tear fell from the corner of her eye. How blissful. This feeling was simply too blissful. For more than 2 years, she had been living in the shadows. At this moment, she finally felt the scorching sunlight enveloping her once more. It turned out that what she hated wasn't the food, but her past self. But now, it seemed that the one he shouldn't hate the most was himself. "It's so delicious." She swallowed the tofu with tears in her eyes and ate another mouthful of rice. Georgina's bag had been completely thrown away by her, and she scooped another spoonful of mapo tofu into her mouth. Spicy and refreshing, one mouthful after another, he simply couldn't stop. "Looks like it is indeed very appetizing." Harrison's lips curled up slightly when he saw this. He swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth. Although he had lost, it seemed like he had won again. Anyway, he was happy to see Georgina take the initiative to eat. Kenneth looked at Georgina, who was enjoying her food. This bald, tattooed uncle, who looked rather mighty, had tears in his eyes, and he had a gratified expression on his face. It had been 2 years, and he finally saw Georgina pick up the spoon herself and eat in big mouthfuls. Many sleepless nights, he wanted to ask others, "What should I do if my child doesn't eat?" The matter that had troubled him so much that his hair had turned white was finally resolved at this moment. Then, his gaze landed on Harrison, and there was a hint of approval in his judging gaze. If it weren't for this little fatty today, he probably wouldn't have been able to make Georgina take the initiative to eat. However, if he wanted to pursue Georgina, then he wouldn't agree so easily.
Ding!
The spoon touched the bottom of the bowl, and the rice could already be seen. However, there was still more than half of the mapo tofu left. Georgina was stunned for a moment, and then her face flushed red. She actually finished an entire bowl of rice. "I haven't touched my bowl yet. Why don't you eat first?" Harrison smiled as he placed his bowl of rice in front of Georgina. Georgina looked at Harrison, and then at the bowl of rice. She suddenly smiled at Harrison and said, "Thank you." Then, she picked up the spoon and continued eating. "Is it really that appetizing?" Harrison asked Yabamiya to add another bowl of rice for him. He also scooped up a spoonful of mapo tofu curiously and put it into his mouth. Although it had been on the table for some time, the instant the mapo tofu entered his mouth, it still made him shiver. The tofu melted in his mouth, and a spicy taste blossomed in his mouth. He was caught off guard by the delicious taste. After swallowing a mouthful of mapo tofu, Harrison opened his mouth and exhaled. The spicy and salty taste filled his mouth. Right now, he just wanted to find a bowl of rice and eat it in the kitchen. Meg looked at Georgina, who was enjoying her meal, and couldn't help but murmur, "Harrison still has some skills." "What did you say?" Phyllis, who was loading the plate, turned around and asked. "Nothing. I said that the barbecued meat needs to be brushed with the sauce again," Meg said with a smile. He could work hard to help an anorexic patient regain her appetite, but he would have to work harder to help her walk out of her depressed state of mind. After finishing the second bowl of rice, the plate of mapo tofu was also empty. Burp! Georgina let out a burp, and then covered her mouth in embarrassment. Harrison, who had finished eating first, also put down his spoon at about the same time. He looked at Georgina with a smile and said, "Clearly you've won. This mapo tofu is indeed a very appetizing dish. It's not suitable to be a snack by itself." Georgina replied softly. The smile on her face showed that she was in a good mood. "I'm willing to accept my loss. I can agree to one of your requests." Harrison looked at Georgina with a serious expression and asked, "What do you want me to do?" Georgina lowered her head and pondered for a while. As if she had made up her mind, she raised her head and looked at Harrison and said, "Can you accompany me to find those snacks?" Her hand, which was hanging by her side, subconsciously grasped the corner of her clothes. After saying that, she looked away as if she was waiting for judgment. Harrison was slightly taken aback, and then a smile appeared on his face. He nodded and said, "Sure, I can accompany you at any time. I'll be at your beck and call." Georgina looked at Harrison, and her eyes lit up. A smile slowly bloomed on her pale face. She had found light again, a light that was willing to shine on her body. Chapter 1903. Meg received a big red packet, which made him feel like a matchmaker. Oh no, it should be called a matchmaker. Of course, he was happy to receive a red packet. However, what made him even happier was that Harrison could find a girl that he liked and was willing to care for and protect her wholeheartedly. It could be considered a meritorious deed to help her walk out of the haze and illness. Mapo tofu is indeed good stuff. Meg smiled and put the red packet away carefully. He looked around to make sure that Irina was not around before he heaved a sigh of relief. The existence of delicacies was to let people enjoy eating. If he could inadvertently change some people's lives, it would make him feel that cooking was actually a very wonderful thing. Mapo tofu was a dish that went well with rice, and it received unanimous praise from the customers. This also caused the rice to sell exceptionally well today. "Georgina, why don't we go skiing?" Kenneth said to Georgina with a doting look in the carriage. Georgina looked at Kenneth, but she did not say anything for a long time. How did that authoritative father of hers, who used to be a man of his word, suddenly age so much? His slightly protruding hair was already white, and the wrinkles on his face were clearly visible. His originally strong and straight back was also slightly bent. All of this was because of her. She hurt herself and the people closest to her for someone who had never even looked at her properly. She was really silly. Georgina's nose twitched, and she jumped into Kenneth's arms. She choked as she said, "Father, I'm sorry." Kenneth's body stiffened slightly. He looked at Georgina, who was sobbing in his arms, and smiled with relief. He patted her back gently. Good girl, good girl. Today is really a good day." Harrison stood beside the carriage, looked up at the sky, and laughed out loud. "Boss, is there any good news today?" the coachman asked curiously. Good news. Of course there's good news. Harrison smiled, but did not say much to the coachman. He had already made an appointment with Miss Georgina to look for those famous snacks from Cedar Alley tomorrow morning. He felt like he was in love. Although the other party was only a girl he had eaten with once, and they had not spoken more than 100 words, he was already certain that he had met the right person. You can go back first. I'll be strolling around the Aiden Square this afternoon. You can have half a day off. Harrison waved his hand at the coachman and strutted away. Although he had made an appointment with Miss Georgina tomorrow, he still planned to explore the path today and do some preparatory work so that he could perform better tomorrow. This was the first time he had such a strong urge to fall in love since he became an adult. Falling in love was no small matter. Most of the time, it was a conspiracy that had been planned for a long time. Therefore, boys must be careful outside. The representatives of all the races were gathered in Chaos City and were discussing the joint investigation in the meeting hall. The representative team from the Roth Empire was led by Sean. The giant dragons Lewis and Douglas had also come, which showed how much importance they attached to this. Every race had sent out a level 10 expert as their representative. It was not a small matter for the devil to break free from the seal. Why aren't Alex and Irina here? Douglas asked Michael. The representatives of all the races were also looking at Michael. This matter was discovered by Alex and Irina. Now that the representatives of all the races were gathered, only the two of them were missing. I only get to see these two once in a while. Michael shook his head with a smile. Then, he got someone to turn on the projection and showed the scene of the cave that Meg had taken that day to the representatives of all the races. The expressions of the representatives of all the races gradually became serious. Many of them had seen the seal in the Thunderstorm Mountains with their own eyes, so they knew very well what this broken stone door and the broken spell formation meant. It's indeed a mark left behind by a giant dragon. And I'm afraid only Rankster has such power, Lewis said in a low voice. Everyone looked at Douglas. This great elder of the Frost Dragon tribe had the most right to speak. Douglas was silent for a while before he sighed and said, Rankster disappeared 3 years ago. There's no news or trace of him until now. This matter was not a secret. Rankster and Alex disappeared almost at the same time. This had also caused some speculation back then. Michael said. Alex said that only a frost dragon scale was found at the scene. Rankster's corpse was not found. What happened in this sealed land back then? We need everyone to go and unravel it together. Since that's the case, why don't we set off now and explore that so-called sealed land first before making a decision, Sean said.
All right.
Let's set off then. Michael nodded. He got up and led the representatives to the front yard. Not long after, flying mounts of different styles took off from the city lord's castle and left the city. North of the city, in the textile factory, Ashley walked into Irina's office. She looked at Irina, who was studying the blueprints, and said, Princess, the infrastructure special agent team has been integrated. There are a total of 3,000 elves. 300 of them are in charge of supplying the wood. The first batch of wood that was planted last night has already matured. Very good. Irina put down the blueprints. She looked at Ashley and said, after we finish building this school, don't disband this team. We might be able to take on some other projects. The dwarves' aesthetic dictates that they can only do rough work, but we can do delicate work.
All right.
Ashley nodded. She did not have any doubts about Irina's decision at all. The Night Elves had already passed the initial difficult period when they migrated to Chaos City. Now, they were arranging flexible employment for the elves in an orderly manner and integrating into Chaos City. During this process, Irina had made many wise decisions. As the executor, she obeyed unconditionally. Suddenly, Irina looked up at the sky outside the window. After some thought, she got up and said, I'm going out for a while. You can study the blueprints first. With that, she had already disappeared. Luna visited 10 odd retired teachers in the morning. Almost all of them expressed their willingness to be reemployed and teach the children in the new school after they understood her intentions. Please go back. Thank you very much. Luna came out from an arithmetic teacher's house and closed the door for him with a smile on her face. Number 15. It went unexpectedly smoothly. Irina took out a little notebook, opened it, and made a tick on a name. There were still dozens of unvisited names on it. Indeed, teachers doted on their children the most. As long as it was something within their capabilities, they would almost never reject it. Two of the teachers were not in good health, so Luna did not mention it. It was best to work within one's capabilities. The next one is Teacher Kakashi. I wonder if he's sleeping now if I go over. Luna bought 2 pancakes from the roadside and ate them with the cold water that she brought with her as she planned her afternoon schedule. Chapter 1904. After the lunchtime service ended, Meg took a look at the entrance of the delicacy conference from afar. He was relieved when he saw the long line outside the small seafood shop. During the morning and lunchtime service, many customers had asked about the fried octopus tentacles. Meg told them clearly that it was the limited version of the delicacy conference. Everyone could learn how to make it at home or wait for next year's delicacy conference. It was very sneaky, but it was an effective conversion method. Furthermore, in the series of octopus tentacles, other than the octopus balls, the other 3 dishes were very simple and quick to make. Judging from the increasing number of believers, it should become a common dish on the dining table of Chaos City's commoners in no time. They could spend tens of copper coins to buy ingredients at home, and they could eat the delicacies that cost hundreds of copper coins at the restaurant. Furthermore, the taste would not be too different. It was a huge profit. Of course, you might be able to make a huge profit, but Meg, who sold the octopus tentacles, would never make a loss. When Meg returned to the restaurant, he was dragged away by an excited Hannah. I refuse. Before Meg could state his position clearly, Hannah had already taken out a thick metal pipe. She looked at Meg excitedly and said, "Boss, we did it. It's a high-quality sealed pipe that can withstand high-pressure steam. It definitely won't explode now." Not bad. Meg inspected the tube carefully before nodding. He then looked at the various parts that were strewn all over the floor with a smile and asked, "Is it almost done?" "We can assemble it tomorrow. The Mobai boss found me an awesome craftsman to help me seal it. I guarantee there won't be any problems." Hannah nodded happily. Although she had 2 dark circles under her eyes and a few charcoal stains on her face, it did not affect her mood at all. "I will make a trip over tomorrow," Hannah said. He was really worried about Hannah. He was the one who provided the blueprint this time. As long as the workmanship and dimensions were correct, there shouldn't be any problems. However, to be safe, it was better for him to go over personally. "That's even better." Hannah smiled, revealing 2 rows of neat teeth. She couldn't hide her excitement at the thought of re-establishing her brewery in Chaos City, and a bigger and more advanced brewery at that. "Thank you for your hard work, Mobai boss and Lulu." Meg greeted the 2, who were hammering away in the workshop. "Hee with Mr. Max Yongjo fried rice. It's not hard at all." Mobai wiped his sweat and chuckled. These days, they were rushing to finish their work, so Hannah packed all the food in Mobai, saving him the trouble of waiting in line. "When this job is done, let's get together and have a drink or 2. Meg liked this kind of honest person. He didn't want to disturb their work and went back to the restaurant. There was information about Rankster from the Grey Temple in the study. This person was once considered to be Alex's rival and the chosen one of the Frost Dragons. There were many legends about him. Hence, there was a lot of information about him in the Grey Temple's intelligence department. The Great Old One broke the seal and didn't leave any clues or traces behind. And Rankster became the only breakthrough. However, he disappeared from everyone's sight 3 years ago, so he could only try to find some relevant information from this information. He spent more than an hour reading. Meg didn't find any relevant information about the Great Old One, but he learned about Rankster's life. He was indeed a ruthless person. As an illegitimate son that the Golden Dragon and Frost Dragon tribes didn't like, and a mixed-blood dragon who was thought to have low talent, he was reborn from desperate situations time and time again. He slapped everyone in the face again and again, and finally stepped onto the Frost Throne with his hands stained with blood. If he was the main character, he could totally write an exciting and hot-blooded Dragon King story. Moreover, Rankster had lived in Chaos City for a period of time more than 10 years ago. However, there weren't any detailed records in the information, so he should have hidden his identity back then. This was actually quite interesting. Rankster was already the chief of the Frost Dragon tribe more than 10 years ago, and he was the one with real power, not the puppet of the Council of Elders. However, with his identity, why did he hide his identity and come to Chaos City? Is he dead? Or is he trapped somewhere? Or is he being controlled? Meg put all the information back into the box with a frown. Given Rankster's character, there was basically no possibility of him hiding somewhere. Unless his current situation is similar to mine back then and he's also seriously injured? Meg suddenly thought of a possibility. Rankster had made countless enemies along the way. His enemies were even more than Alex's. There were even many Frost Dragons who wanted to kill him as soon as possible. There were too many people in this world who wanted him dead. Even if he was weak, they wouldn't allow it. His wife and children needed the protection of his undying will. Therefore, even though he had been missing for 3 years without any news and the Frost Throne was still empty, no one dared to target Elizabeth directly. This is really making me bald. Meg got up and scratched his head. He still couldn't find his thoughts.
Ding.
Congratulations, host. The number of believers has exceeded 10,000. You have successfully advanced to the level of a head chef. Right at this moment, the system's voice suddenly sounded in Meg's mind. Meg's movements froze instantly. He felt a mysterious power suddenly entering his head from the top of his head. His spirit seemed to have been elevated at this moment. This feeling was like being enlightened. It was extremely magical. Is this the power of a head chef? Meg slowly clenched his fists. After a while, he rolled his eyes and said, "Why don't I feel anything?" Although he felt enlightened, Meg felt that his power didn't have any substantial improvement. Host, please use your heart to feel. The power of a chef isn't just an increase in strength. It is expressed in all aspects. The system's voice sounded again. Could it be that the speed of shifting the blame has increased? Meg raised his brow. He didn't really believe the system's nonsense. The reward for advancement has been issued. Affinity +1. The system's voice sounded again. Meg felt a chill on the top of his head this time. His slightly upturned hairstyle was strangely suppressed, but he still didn't feel anything. That's it. Meg's brows furrowed even tighter. He felt that he had been deceived. Affinity is a type of temperament. Currently, the host's body is also silently nourishing. It won't cause any obvious changes to the host's body. The system explained. Then it's better to make the parts that should grow longer. Meg curled his lips. In any case, he felt that he had been deceived. If the host doesn't believe me, you can go out and take a walk. I'll take a walk then. What's the big deal? Meg stomped down the stairs, opened the door, and went out. He came face to face with a young lady who was standing at the entrance of the restaurant. She seemed to be looking at the restaurant's announcement. When the door was opened, a gust of wind was brought up, and it also brought up a skirt. Chapter 1905. Meg swore that he didn't do it on purpose. At the very least, he wouldn't stoop so low as to do something so despicable. Cherry powder. No, he had already closed his eyes. Screams chaos. According to the speed of the free fall, the hem of the dress had already landed where it should be. Meg opened his eyes and looked at the woman who was holding the hem of her dress and taking a few steps back. She was looking at him with a panicked expression.
Vivian?
Meg finally saw the woman clearly and then relaxed a lot. At least she was someone he knew. Mr. Mac, you're actually this kind of person. Vivian held the hem of her dress and looked at Meg, who was standing at the entrance of the restaurant, with a shocked and shy expression. I'm sorry, Miss Vivian. I didn't expect you to be standing outside the door. But don't worry, I closed my eyes just now, and I didn't see anything. Meg said apologetically. He was indeed in the wrong, and this kind of thing was quite serious for a girl. Vivian looked at the earnest expression on Meg's face, and for some reason, her anger subsided a little. After all, Boss Mag had never been interested in women, and always maintained a respectful distance and basic respect toward women. He wasn't the type to take advantage of women, so it was rather strange for her to be standing in front of his door. Thus, she put down her hand and awkwardly said, "All right, I'll let this go." "That's it?" Meg was a little surprised. He thought he would have to explain why the wind was so loud and why the door was so open and why there was a gust of wind when he opened the door. He didn't expect Vivian to just look at him and let it go. Could this be the so-called affinity plus one? Mag raised his eyebrows slightly. He couldn't quite grasp it. "Miss Vivian, may I know why you're outside the restaurant at this time?" Meg changed the topic. "Yes, I'm here to look for you." Vivian nodded. I heard that you and Luna are going to build a new school. Can I be a teacher?" Vivian went straight to the point. "If I remember correctly, you registered for Chaos School, right?" Meg was a little surprised. Vivian nodded. "Yes, but I've decided to give up Chaos School and join your new school." "He didn't get in." "Mr. Mack." Vivian blushed and was a little embarrassed, but she still insisted, I'm just 1 or 2 points away. Teacher Luna is in charge of recruiting teachers. In the spirit of being responsible for the children, there should still be tests and interviews. You can sign up first." Meg smiled and didn't say anything. However, Vivian was indeed an outstanding lady, and it wouldn't be a problem for her to be a teacher. "If that's the case, I should have gone straight to Luna." Vivian nodded and waved at Meg. "Goodbye, Mr. Mack." "Goodbye." Meg watched as Vivian boarded the carriage and left. Their group was rapidly expanding, which was a good thing. After sending Vivian off, Meg went to walk around the streets again. Although he wasn't so handsome that he could attract a lot of attention and make pretty girls scream, Meg could clearly feel that the passers-by who looked at him were obviously kind to him. Even the cats and dogs that were walking around would voluntarily wag their tails when they saw him. Seems like this is the so-called affinity plus one. Meg went back to the restaurant thoughtfully. This kind of temperamental element enhancement was indeed very subtle. An ability that could increase one's height was definitely a very precious ability. First impressions could determine a lot of things in the interactions between people. If you couldn't give others a passing first impression, it meant that no matter how talented you were, they wouldn't be interested in getting to know you at all. The higher the affinity, the easier it was to gain the favorability of others and build the trust of others. This is simply an ability that's tailor-made for sales. Meg touched his chin. So far, this seemed to be the only benefit he felt from the cultivation of the God of Cookery system. And this ability was also very practical for him at the moment. If he wanted to gain more fans and improve his culinary skills, a higher affinity would make it easier for him to gain fans. Interesting. Meg nodded. He was already thinking about whether he should replace the videotape of the food conference and re-record it now. As soon as the door closed, a dazzling white light suddenly lit up in the middle of the restaurant. Then, a figure stood up with a table on her head. Their eyes met and they were both stunned. "That... Boss, don't look. Help me move the table on my head away first." Barbara looked at Meg and said unhappily, "Okay." Meg smiled and helped Barbara move the table on her head away. To be honest, if she lowered her head, the table wouldn't be able to move. Barbara, who had changed into a pink dress, touched her head and kicked the table. Then she looked around. "They're not here." "Yes, they're all in Mia's shop." Meg nodded. Barbara looked at Meg and sized him up. She felt that he seemed a little different, but she couldn't tell what the difference was. She frowned and thought for a while, then asked, "Have you showered?" "You can tell?" Meg frowned. He felt that this girl's question was a little strange. "No, I'm just saying hello. I'm going to play with them." Barbara also quickly realized that there seemed to be something wrong with her question. She blushed and ran to the door, as if she was escaping. She opened the door and turned back 3 seconds later. She closed the door, exhaled a breath of cold air, and shivered. "It's so cold. Why is it still winter?" Meg rolled his eyes as he looked at Barbara, who was wearing a thin dress, and snickered. "It was winter when you left. You've only been gone for a few days, and you want it to be summer when you come back." It's hot in the Moon Nation now. Who knew it's still so cold here? Barbara stomped her feet angrily, or maybe because of the cold.
Put it on.
Remember to bring it back for me at night. Meg went upstairs to get a coat and casually draped it over Barbara's body. The mid-length trench coat covered her body, and it hung down to her ankles. It's so warm. Barbara suddenly felt that she could move again. She thanked Meg and opened the door again to go out. Barbara is back. The new request for help should be coming soon. It seems like the Moon Nation is going to be deeply bound to the Norland continent. Meg smiled. As long as the representatives of the various races confirmed that the Great Old One had indeed broken the seal and escaped, how to find and reseal it would be on the agenda. If the Great Old One couldn't be killed, they could only use the seal to temporarily trap it again, and then find other ways to kill it, such as eating it. During dinner, Barbara took out the local specialties she brought from the Moon Nation one by one and gave them to everyone. Apart from the dazzling golden jewels, the more interesting ones were the irregular moonstones that emitted a soft silver light. Please subscribe. The number of subscriptions has dropped a lot recently. My dear readers, please subscribe to Chidian's original version. I can't afford to eat. Chapter 1906. The moonstone had a smooth surface, and its texture was like jade. It was warm and cool to the touch, and glowed on its own. It looked very dreamy, and was more popular than tacky jewelry. It's so beautiful. I want to make it into a pendant. It looks like a teardrop. It's so beautiful, and said with a smile as she held a small moonstone in her hands. Yabamiya picked a round moonstone, and also happily said, I want to polish this one. I want to make it into a moonstone ring. It looks even better than a jade ring. Do you all like this stone so much? Barbara looked at everyone with a strange expression. Barbara, this moonstone must be very expensive, right? Phyrus asked Barbara with an embarrassed expression. I just grabbed a bunch of them from the garden before we set off. These stones are very common in our world. Barbara shrugged. She looked at everyone with incredulity and said, I didn't know you all liked this. If I had known, I would have asked them to pick something prettier. Things are valuable when they are rare. This moonstone's quality is higher than many jade stones, and it can glow on its own. It can be made into a very good piece of art with some polishing. However, there are so many of them on the moon, so they're not very valuable there. Meg picked up a moonstone with a smile and said, but they can't be found on the Norland continent. As long as we label them as imported from the moon, we can definitely sell them for a high price. Then, why don't we sell the stones? We can bring the worthless moonstones from the moon to Chaos City to sell. We can definitely make a lot of money, Amy suggested. Her eyes were already glowing. Meg looked at Amy with approval. This little girl's brain worked very quickly. She had the potential to be a businessman at such a young age. Will people really want them? Barbara was still a little unsure. There were too many moonstones in the Moon Nation. Their ground was paved with huge moonstones, and the quality was much better than these small stones. Next time you go back to the Moon Nation, bring as many as you can. I promise I'll sell all of them. We'll split the profits 50-50. Meg said with a smile. Jewelry was a profiteering industry, especially this kind of extremely high-quality moonstone, which was extremely cheap. If he didn't make a profit of hundreds or thousands of times, he would be embarrassed to call himself a jewelry businessman. Okay, then I'll choose the best decorative stones next time and fill up the spatial ring. Barbara nodded. She was also eager to try. She was not short of money, but she enjoyed making money. By the way, in the future, when you people from the Moon Nation teleport over, you have to inform me in advance. Otherwise, if you keep teleporting into the restaurant, I'll feel a little insecure. Also, I've asked someone to set up some defensive arrays in the restaurant. If they run around randomly, they will inevitably be injured. Meg said again. He didn't want to see the image of the table above his head that Barbara sent him today. Furthermore, the restaurant did have a level 9 defensive ability. If the people from the Moon Nation were to come over and fight with the restaurant, who knew what would happen? Barbara thought for a moment and said, okay, but it's quite troublesome to activate the teleportation portal every time. How about we set a teleportation time every month? That way, It won't affect the restaurant's normal business. That works too. Meg nodded in agreement after thinking for a while. Now, Amy's most valuable thing was actually not the land, but the ancient teleportation portal that connected the Moon Nation and the Norland continent. It was equivalent to blocking the communication between the two parties. If Barbara wasn't the princess of the Moon Nation, Meg could raise the price directly and make everyone who wanted to use this teleportation portal pay an entrance fee first. It would definitely be more profitable than opening a restaurant. Now, both parties were still in the early stages of communication, and the Norland continent needed the Moon Nation's help to seal the Great Old Ones. Naturally, he couldn't do such a thing. However, if both parties started a high-end moon landing tourism project in the future, Meg would be very willing to take a huge sum of money from those rich people who wanted to go to the moon. "How long do you plan to stay this time?" Meg asked. Now that the passage back to the Moon Nation was open, Barbara could go home anytime. "I'm back to work. I'll stay until the restaurant closes down," Barbara said matter-of-factly. "As long as I don't close the restaurant, Amy's will never close down." Meg pursed his lips and looked at Barbara perplexedly. "Aren't you happy being a princess? You even came here to wait for the service staff. What's so special about being a princess?"
We have plenty of them here.
After staying at home for a few days, being a princess is indeed very boring. I might as well work. It's so good here. I love it here. Barbara shook her head. "All right, as long as you like it." Meg raised his eyebrows. It seemed like times had indeed changed. Working had become a trendy thing. Barbara's return meant that the manpower shortage at Amy's would be greatly alleviated. With the magical power of spatial magic, Barbara could be said to be the absolute center of the restaurant when it came to serving the dishes. She could serve the dishes to the customers efficiently. Today's dinner was quite sumptuous. It was a welcome banquet that Meg prepared for Barbara, so it was half an hour earlier than usual. Outside the restaurant, there were already people lining up to wait. In the line, there was a tall man in black. His hat was pulled very low, and he lowered his head slightly. He softly asked the bald, middle-aged man standing in front of him, "Chief Editor Garland, will anyone still recognize me like this?" The bald man, who was called the chief editor, turned his head to look at the black-clothed man. He snappily smiled and said, "Milo, if you look like this, those who recognize you will naturally recognize you. Those who don't will instead look at you a few more times. Perhaps they will recognize you." "How terrible is that?" Milo was shocked. He looked around warily. "This is Chaos City. You have never been here before and have never revealed any restaurant secrets. You don't have to worry about being beaten up," Garland said with a smile. Garland, the chief editor of Whole Foods and Beauty's gourmet magazine. As one of the most influential gourmet magazines on the Norland continent, Whole Foods and Beauty had not been having a good time recently. The sales of carnivore and vegetarianism had broken records for the past 2 to 3 months. Reprinting had become a regular method, and the sales of hundreds of thousands of copies easily pushed Whole Foods and Beauty to the ground. And the reason why the sales of carnivore and vegetarianism's magazines had skyrocketed in the past 2 to 3 months was all because of one restaurant, and that was this Mamie's in front of them. Those two magazines had at least one article in their new issues in the past 2 months that was related to Mamie's. It was because of this that their sales skyrocketed, and even made many people who did not have the habit of subscribing to gourmet magazines fall into the trap. Being left far behind by their competitors, Whole Foods and Beauty was naturally unwilling to just sit and wait. Hence, Garland personally brought Whole Foods and Beauty's gold medal writer, the gentle assassin Milo, from Rodu to this place. He wanted to break the lie that carnivore and vegetarianism had created together. How could there be such an excellent local restaurant in a place like Chaos City that was barren of food? Whole Foods and Beauty would use a realistic article to kick this restaurant off its pedestal and trample on those two shameless magazines. Chapter 1907. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Please wait for a moment. After the content is updated, please refresh the page to get the latest update. Chapter 1908. Randy's words about how difficult it was to find good food made Milo agree with him deeply. He even wanted to see him as a soulmate. He was someone who had a strict attitude towards food and was not a natural sarcastic person. If those businesses could restrain themselves a little and not serve those crudely made food to the customers' tables, he wouldn't even bother to write anything. If there was any food that was worthy of his recommendation, he wouldn't hesitate to write about it. But until now, the frequency of such delicacies appearing was extremely low. He had been to many places before, but the more he went, the more disappointed he was. They were not even as good as those restaurants that he dissed in Rodu. Milo couldn't help but look forward to Mamie's being praised so highly by Randy. Of course, there was caution in this anticipation. It could also be that Randy hadn't eaten any delicacies before, so he came to such a conclusion. It wasn't impossible. I heard that Mr. Mac just launched a new product today. He couldn't get out of bed in the afternoon, so he booked this place for dinner. He must have wanted to try the mapo tofu. Randy's smile was full of anticipation. It's pretty good. Milo nodded with a smile. It was obvious that he had a lot of feelings for this restaurant. And judging from the customers, this restaurant shouldn't be looking for people to buy in. To be able to make so many customers line up in advance to wait for the door to open willingly, this restaurant was more or less capable. However, Milo still had doubts about the standard of this restaurant. It would only be good if he tasted it personally and felt that it was good. He felt that any restaurant with good reviews in Rodu would be as popular as this restaurant if they opened a branch in Chaos City. This was the so-called dimensionality reduction. The owner of this restaurant might have come from somewhere else, or even Rodu, and then used the delicacies that were a level above the average in Chaos City to gain a group of diners. This wait lasted for half an hour. Milo and Randy chatted casually from time to time and got along quite well. The restaurant's door finally opened, and a young man in a clean and tidy chef's uniform walked out. He smiled and welcomed the customers. "Look, that's Mr. Mac, the owner and head chef of this restaurant." Randy introduced him to Milo. "So young." Milo looked at Meg with some surprise. He seemed to be around 30 years old. For a chef, his physique was a little too skinny. If it were a bigger pot, he might not be able to lift it. Being a chef was a job that required physical strength. Moreover, he was wearing such a white chef's uniform. Although he always required chefs to be particular about their attire and behavior, letting a chef work in the kitchen dressed like this was a bit of a show. Wouldn't a set of clothes be ruined if a bit of oil was spilled on the clothes when cooking? Or did he have to change into a new chef's uniform every day? In Milo's opinion, dressing like this in the kitchen was tantamount to binding one's hands and increasing the difficulty of cooking in vain. Yes, young and promising. That's probably what Mr. Mac is like. Randy nodded in agreement. Then, he said with some envy, "The number of girls who want to marry Mr. Mac is enough to circle the Aiden Square. This is really enviable." Milo was also a little jealous. The customers began to enter the restaurant, and Milo and the others followed the line. He watched as Meg greeted the customers familiarly. It was not the polite kind, but the kind that could call out each other's nicknames or nicknames. "The atmosphere is really good." Milo nodded slightly. It was a small detail, but it made people feel that the restaurant was more humane. "Mr. Mac." Randy and Meg smiled and greeted each other. Meg glanced at Randy's gradually obvious dark circles and said earnestly, "Although it's good to be young, you have to let your kidneys rest." "I can't rest anymore, but I'm here to cheer you on," Randy said with a smile as he winked at Lindley. Meg also smiled. He knew that Randy had been living off a woman recently. A 30-year-old young woman was at the age where she was like a wolf. How could he rest just because he said so? Since he chose to eat this meal, he had to have this awareness. However, one word was written all over his face. So delicious. "Just eat one more Reggiano later," Meg said. "Hee, that's for sure." Randy smiled and walked in quickly, not blocking the customers behind him. Meg nodded slightly at Garland and Milo as a greeting. The customers who did not look familiar at all should be coming to the restaurant for the first time. Comfortable hospitality. He can joke and be serious. Milo gave Meg a good first impression in his heart. After entering the restaurant, Milo's eyes lit up. The size of the restaurant could only be considered medium-sized. There were dozens of tables in the hall, and they were simply separated from each other. It did not affect the overall transparency, and at the same time, allowed the customers to have a relatively private dining space. On the right was the designated hot pot area, which was separated from the ordinary dining area. There were only 2 arched entrances and exits. It was said that eating hot pot and having a normal meal were 2 different atmospheres. The first impression Milo had of the restaurant's table arrangement and decorations was that it was amazing. It was not because it was gorgeous, nor was it because it was huge. It was a kind of comfort that made people feel at ease. The appropriate distance between the tables, the fresh wood decorations, and small green plants were pleasing to the eye. This kind of feeling that made people feel relaxed as soon as they stepped into the restaurant and wanted to sit down and order food surprised him. This was probably the atmosphere that every restaurant wanted to create, but none of the restaurants he had been to did it as well as Mamie's. What surprised him even more was the girls on both sides. There were half-dragons, elves, orcs, demons. Although they were of different races, they all had stunning looks. "This boss is too good," Milo praised in his heart, but he politely withdrew his gaze and reminded himself again and again that he was here for the food today. "Sit here." Garland chose a seat near the kitchen. From here, she could better observe the restaurant, including watching the waiters serve the dishes and listening to the movements in the kitchen. "This kitchen is open?" As soon as Milo sat down, he found that the kitchen partition was actually a large crystal wall. Sitting in his position, he could easily see everything in the kitchen. "It's really—" Garland also turned her head when she heard that. She could not hide the surprise on her face. This is Mr. Mac's confidence and pride. Even if it's open for everyone to see, he's not afraid that others will learn. Randy came to their table and said with a smile, "Mamie's rules are to share tables. Brothers, do you mind if I sit here?" Chapter 1909. Of course, Milo minded it. After all, it would not be easy for them to communicate with each other when there was another person around. However, he had seen Amy's rule of sharing tables in Randy's and Derek's articles. It was one of Amy's characteristics, so he naturally had no reason to reject it. Moreover, this young man had a pleasant conversation with him earlier and answered many of his questions. He also had the thought of making friends with him. Hence, he nodded with a smile and said, "Of course. Please take a seat." "Thank you." Randy sat down with a smile. He looked at the 2 of them with a smile and said, "My name is Randy. May I know how to address the 2 of you? What business are you doing in Chaos City?" "Randy?" Milo and Garland were taken aback at the same time. They looked at each other with a strange expression. Their purpose for coming today was to expose fraud. Other than this restaurant, half of it was because of Randy and Derek. However, they did not expect to meet the real deal here and even sit at the same table. They could not help but feel a little awkward. Seeing that the 2 of them did not answer, Randy smiled and said, "It's hard to say."
Forget it, then.
"Don't mind it. It's fate that we met. I just want to leave my name so that we can meet again in the future." "Why would I?" "I'm Lomai, and this is my brother, Garland. We are fur merchants." Milo laughed heartily and winked at Garland. Yes. The 2 of us are fur merchants." Garland understood tacitly and nodded cooperatively. Milo's reputation was really a little bad. If they were recognized on the spot, they might be chased out. This kind of thing happened from time to time in Rodu. "So, you're fur merchants?" "When I was traveling around the continent in the past, I would often hitch a ride with a caravan. Fur merchants are the easiest to deal with." Randy smiled, and then looked at the 2 of them puzzledly. "But shouldn't fur merchants be going to the orc tribes to collect their goods during the season? Why are you guys in Chaos City?" Milo was stunned. Being a fur merchant was a profession that he made up casually. He did not expect Randy to know about it. "We've already received the goods for this year. We've specially shipped them to Chaos City to hand them over to an old buyer," Garland quickly said. Randy was enlightened. "So that's the case. Then, We have to try Mamie's delicacies in Chaos City these few days. We won't be able to eat them when we return to Rodu. Hee hee. Milo and Garland looked at each other and smiled, relieved. Then another orc sat down at Milo's table. Sharing tables at Amy's was a common practice. Milo and Garland were surprised to see elves, demons, orcs, and goblins sitting at the next table. The guests of the four races sat at the same table, and the atmosphere was unexpectedly harmonious. Occasionally there would be conversations, and then they would order separately. Such a miraculous sight could not be seen anywhere else. Not to mention Rodu. Even in the other restaurants in Chaos City, there was no sight of foreign races sharing tables like this. This restaurant was indeed special. This is the menu. It's your first time here, so take a look at the menu first. Randy pushed the menu in front of the two of them and reminded, "Oh yes. You can look at the back of the menu. There are some restaurant rules. Take a look first. Don't break the restaurant's rules."
All right.
Milo nodded. He flipped the menu and looked at the restaurant rules that were neatly written at the back. Usually, when customers chose a restaurant, they would have certain requirements for the restaurant. However, this restaurant was so strange that it actually set rules for its customers. However, after Milo read through all these rules, his impression of them changed greatly. These rules were very detailed and were indeed set up for the customers. However, abiding by these rules would not harm the customers' interests. Instead, it would create a quiet and pleasant dining environment for the customers.
Just like now.
In Rhoda's restaurant, once it was dinner time, even if one hid in a private room, they would not be able to block out the noise coming from all around. Those drunkards who used their voices to make their presence known were a headache, but there was nothing they could do. But here, even the fierce-looking demons spoke in a gentle and soft voice. Milo's impression of this restaurant increased a little. Just the dining environment and atmosphere alone made this restaurant better than all the restaurants he had been to before. Then, he flipped open the menu and looked at the exquisite pictures. Milo's eyes lit up. He did not know what kind of technology was used to reproduce these pictures. They looked very colorful, just like real food. These pictures should be schematics, right? The kind that doesn't match the real thing? Milo asked Randy.
They do not match the real thing.
Milo nodded. Indeed. Milo was deep in thought. This was just a trick that merchants often used. The real thing looks better than this. Flat pictures are not enough to express their attractiveness, Randy said with a smile. Milo glanced at Randy. He wondered if this guy had become this restaurant's hired agent. Randy came over to take a look and muttered, "This mapo tofu looks very appetizing. Seems like I have to order a separate serving of rice, 2 rugiamos, and a serving of red braised pork." Milo also looked at the menu again. Other than the amazement brought by the pictures, the prices of the dishes on the menu were a little shocking. The cheapest dish, the octopus balls, cost 40 copper coins each. All the other dishes cost more than 3 digits. The spicy grilled fish cost more than 1,000, while the Buddha jumps over the wall soup cost an astonishing 10,000 copper coins. Of course, there were restaurants in Rodu that were even more expensive than this, and there were also dishes that were even more shocking than the Buddha jumps over the wall. Furthermore, they already knew before coming, and had some expectations for this price. Milo looked at Garland and asked, "How do we order?" Originally, they had planned to order all the dishes on the menu. However, after looking at the menu, they realized that their budget was only enough to order half of the dishes. However, after looking at the menu just now, the restaurant had a rule that customers had to order in moderation. They could not be extravagant. Hence, now, they had to order according to 2 people's appetites. They had to order something suitable. Garland looked at Milo and said with a smile, "Of course, it's a combination of meat and vegetables. It's nutritious and healthy." Milo was enlightened and looked at Garland with some admiration. Indeed, the older the ginger, the spicier it was. Randy looked at Garland seriously and said, "Brother Garland, you should order the Buddha jumps over the wall. It's a professional treatment for baldness. 1 serving will be effective, and 3 servings will let you have beautiful hair again." Treatment for baldness? Garland's eyes lit up. He had been worried about balding for a long time because of his hair loss. As the saying went, the more he worried, the more it would fall. The more it fell, the more worried he would become. Seeing that his hair was almost all gone, he had also turned from a handsome uncle to a bald uncle. Isn't that so? Immerse is almost becoming a baldness prevention hospital. There are countless customers who come to treat baldness every day. Randy pointed at the table diagonally behind them without batting an eyelid and whispered, "Look at that table over there. It's a gathering of veteran baldness friends. Most of them are here to treat baldness together." Garland turned his head to take a look. From his position, he could only see 4 shiny skulls. However, according to his experience, this was already the late stage of baldness. Generally, it was the stage where people had given up on themselves. Moreover, they would start to talk about the benefits of being bald. Things like it was cooler and it was convenient to wash their hair and so on. "This can be treated?" Garland asked doubtfully. "Just 3 sessions, and I guarantee that they will have beautiful black hair again. If it doesn't work, feel free to look for Mr. Mack." Randy nodded with a serious expression. "Then I'll order one too," Garland said without hesitation. Cough, cough. "Brother, the money we brought might not be enough." Milo coughed dryly. He felt that Garland had fallen into Randy's marketing trap. Garland suddenly realized that their budget was not enough for him to order the Buddha jumps over the wall. 10,000 copper coins to buy a head of beautiful hair. "It's not a dream to return to being 20 years old," Randy said leisurely. "It's okay. I still have some. I'll order this Buddha jumps over the wall." Garland could not help but take out his money bag. Chapter 1910. Milo now seriously suspected that Randy had become this restaurant's top salesman. From the moment they started talking, they had fallen into his trap. It could attack Garland's bald spot and make him lose his rationality as an intellectual by intensifying the pain caused by baldness and verifying it on the spot. 10,000 copper coins. That was Garland's salary for half a month. Even in Rodu, the cost of a meal rarely exceeded 10,000 copper coins. But now, he had ordered a Buddha jumps over the wall that cost 10,000 copper coins. All these years, you've been worried about your rising hairline. You've eaten and used a lot of things. Baldness is not an illness, it's a disability. There's no cure for it. Milo made a final attempt. "Your point of view is quite interesting." Randy smiled. "But even if it's a disability, Mr. Mack can cure you with a bowl of soup." Milo glanced at Randy and thought to himself that he had met an expert.
Bye.
"If I can let my hair grow out before I go back and let my wife see me 20 years younger, it will definitely be very interesting," Garland decided. Milo didn't say anything else. After all, Garland was the chief editor of Whole Foods and Beauty. He was a proper middle-class person. What was wrong with contributing a little money for hair? If there was no effect, then they would have one more material. Randy couldn't escape from false advertising. Shocking. The meat-loving gourmet is actually promoting hair loss prevention products for a restaurant. Such a title was already scheduled to be the first hot article in next month's Whole Foods and Beauty magazine. To be honest, Milo was a little disappointed from the time he queued until now. He had accumulated his firepower all the way, but when he came to Immerse, he realized that he had nothing to say. As an expert in the world of finding fault, he had a pair of eyes that could find fault, and a mouth that could use the most simple words to say the most hurtful words. But he just had to come across a restaurant that made him speechless and unable to say any harsh words. Even his tone had become gentler because of the environment and rules. These are all illusory things. Whether it's a mule or a horse, we'll know when it's served. Milo placed his order and waited for the dishes to be served. The dishes he ordered were very simple, a combination of meat and vegetables. They were all dishes that Randy and Derek had written about in the vegetarian and carnivorous books. Since he was here to pick a fight, as a professional, of course, he couldn't make things up. This wasn't his style. Accurate sniping and head-on attacks were his specialty. While waiting for the dishes to be served, Milo turned his head and looked in the direction of the kitchen, but his eyes widened a little. From his position, he could clearly see the inside of the kitchen through the glass window. It was completely different from the kitchens he had seen before. It was clean and bright, and the spacious space was almost half the size of the dining room. He could only see part of the operating table. At this moment, Meg was like a great general overseeing the army. The pot on the stove was his right-hand man, and the spatula in his hand was his command flag and weapon. He could be seen walking between several stoves, cooking several different kinds of food at the same time. He even had the time to flip the hundreds of skewers on the grill beside him, using a brush to brush them with oil and various sauces. It was very exaggerated, you know? Other people's kitchens were equipped with a few chefs, and there were also a few helpers and apprentices waiting by their side. Not to mention that the work was in full swing, the efficiency was not necessarily high. However, Mag was doing all the work related to cooking alone, including taking out the wok and serving the dishes. Yet, people felt that he was doing it with ease and even felt that he could add 2 more woks worth of dishes. As for efficiency, Milo, who was sitting by the kitchen door, had already seen the dishes floating past him and then landing in front of the guests who had ordered the dishes. It seems that Miss Barbara has returned. This is the first time you've seen a spatial magician serving dishes, right? Randy said with a smile. It's the first time. Milo nodded. He made a rough assessment in his mind. The speed of serving dishes was incredible. For a medium-sized restaurant, this speed of serving dishes required an overloaded high-end kitchen. And now, there was only one person in the kitchen cooking leisurely. This boss is a monster, right? Milo swallowed his saliva. This casual operation had already surpassed all the chefs in the world. At this level, Mr. Mack actually restrained himself. 2 days ago, he went to the gourmet conference and set up a stall. Thousands of people lined up, and he did it alone. When I was in line, I felt that there were after-images of his hands. The efficiency of serving dishes was 10 times that of the stall with more than a dozen people next door. Randy turned his head to look in the direction of the kitchen and said with a smile, "Isn't this too casual?" "I can't feel the soul," Garland complained. Randy chuckled. "I feel that this is more soulful than those chefs who repeat the same actions with a dull face. Being relaxed and casual is absolute confidence in one's culinary skills." And from Mr. Mack's focused expression, I can see that he enjoys and loves what he's doing. Garland raised his eyebrows. A person with a pen was indeed different. His words made him unable to refute, and he could only look at Milo for help. "Yes, I haven't seen this kind of attitude towards cooking in a long time." Milo nodded in agreement. He looked at Meg with the same admiration. Garland was speechless. They were here to find fault this time to uncover the scam of carnivore and vegetarianism. But now, Milo seemed to be a little out of it. Although it was his usual style to hit hard online and be submissive offline, praise was something that he rarely received. "Here are your dishes.
Please enjoy."
Dishes floated out of the kitchen and then landed lightly in front of them. At the same time, a crisp voice sounded in their ears. Although they had already seen the means of this spatial mage to serve dishes, Milo and Garland were still a little amazed. They felt an inexplicable sense of satisfaction when they thought of the mysterious and rare spatial mage serving them. However, Milo's gaze was quickly attracted by the dishes in front of him. On the long plate in front of him, there was a fish that was split in the middle. The golden red soup was poured over the fish. It was crystal clear and seeped perfectly into the meat of the fish through the crisscrossing cuts. The tempting fish fragrance rose together with the steam, making Milo's throat roll. This taste was too tempting. Garland's expression was similar, but he still asked in a low voice, "We don't seem to have ordered any fish, right?" "This is not fish. This is eggplant with garlic sauce." Randy glanced at it and said with a smile, "This is eggplant with garlic sauce?" Milo and Garland were both shocked. They came closer and looked carefully for a while before realizing that it was indeed not fish on the plate, but eggplant that had been cut into the shape of a fish. It was cut with a knife and fried until golden yellow. If one did not look carefully, it was no different from a fish. Such knife skills and craftsmanship made an extremely ordinary purple eggplant be reborn in an instant. Chapter 1911. The eggplant with garlic sauce had caused quite a stir in the culinary world due to Derek's beautiful article. There were even chefs in Rodu who had replicated the eggplant according to Derek's description, but the eggplant they made tasted very strange, and very few chefs were able to make eggplants as soft as fish. Milo had participated in several of the experiments. It was impossible to make eggplant with garlic sauce without fish, so he had always thought that Derek's description was definitely exaggerated. But now, the eggplant with garlic sauce in front of him had perfectly deceived his eyes with its appearance and fragrance, and also gave him a deep slap in the face. And the words that appeared in his mind were exactly what Derek had described. It had to be said that Derek's words were still simple and simple. He had only truthfully recorded the appearance and fragrance of the eggplant with garlic sauce, but it was precisely because of this that it gave people a strong sense of immersion. It was as if they could see the real delicacy in front of them. Milo and Garland looked at each other and saw a trace of awkwardness in each other's eyes. The appearance matched, but as for whether the taste was as magical as described, they would only know after trying it. Come on, try it. Milo picked up the eggplant with his chopsticks, and put it into his mouth. The soft eggplant almost melted in his mouth. The sour, spicy, sweet, and salty flavors exploded in his mouth almost at the same time, and his taste buds were instantly activated. What a wonderful feeling! Every taste was so prominent, blending with each other, yet so harmonious. It was like a gentle trap that made you step into it step by step and sink into it. There was clearly no fish in this eggplant with garlic sauce, and it was not even cooked with fish soup, but it had a wonderful taste that left fish in the dust. How incredible! This was actually a vegetarian dish. After the taste buds experienced a crazy feast of taste, the eggplant was swallowed, and there was a lingering fragrance between his lips and teeth, and the aftertaste was endless. I didn't expect that there would be someone in this world who could cook eggplants so delicious. Such culinary skills and creativity are really amazing, Milo exclaimed as he looked at the eggplant with garlic sauce. He couldn't help but exclaim. After reading Derek's article and tasting the eggplant with garlic sauce, not only was he not disappointed at all, he was even more surprised. Words were not enough to describe the deliciousness of this dish, or it could be said that everyone who tasted this dish had a unique feeling. This eggplant with garlic sauce brought Milo a great surprise. But when he thought of the purpose of their trip, Milo's expression became slightly awkward. After all, they were here with the intention of exposing Amy's true colors. They also wanted to expose Derek and Randy at the same time. But now he himself had fallen. Garland's expression was even more surprised than Milo's. When he was in Rodu, he and Milo often went out to eat together. They had known each other for more than 10 years, but he had rarely heard Milo praise a certain dish, let alone use the word amazed. Garland picked up the eggplant with a complicated mood and put it into his mouth. Then his eyes lit up, and his expression was no less wonderful than Milo's. After swallowing a mouthful of eggplant and eating a mouthful of rice, Garland nodded and exclaimed, "This eggplant is so fragrant." Not only is it fragrant, but it goes especially well with rice. Milo nodded and ate a mouthful of eggplant and a mouthful of rice with relish. Don't fill your stomach with eggplant with garlic sauce. Isn't the red braised pork delicious? As a carnivore, Randy couldn't help but remind them. When Milo and Garland heard that, they also stared at the red braised pork that Randy had promoted in the previous carnivore forum. The well-balanced streaky pork was cut into long cubes. The fat and the lean were balanced, and the color was bright red. It didn't look greasy at all, but was rather tempting. Milo also had a special liking for meat, but he didn't like pork very much, because the rank odor and greasiness of pork couldn't be handled well by most chefs, not to mention the streaky pork, which was difficult to distinguish between fat and lean. It was the worst part of pork. But this red braised pork had chosen streaky pork as the ingredient and didn't undergo any special treatment. It was just cut into long strips, and even the skin wasn't removed. That was why he had scoffed at Randy's article praising the red braised pork as if the whole world hadn't eaten pork before. But even so, the pork that he usually found greasy now made him want to try it. "Then I'll try it," Milo picked up a piece of red braised pork. From the feedback of the chopsticks, this piece of streaky pork was very soft. After getting closer, the skin looked crystal clear and bouncy, and the rich meat aroma rushed to his nose. The meat aroma was rich and special. A lot of spices should have been added, but they blended together perfectly and harmoniously. There was no rank odor, only the richest meat aroma. What spices did the chef use? Milo wondered in his heart, and then put the meat into his mouth and took a bite. The soft pork almost melted in his mouth. The lean meat was crisp and tough, dry but not dry. The skin was smooth and sticky, and the bite was vague. With a gentle bite, the sweet gravy overflowed from the meat. The taste of the pork was perfectly released at this moment. It was fat but not greasy, sweet and soft. Milo's eyebrows rose crazily, and the satisfaction and incredulity from the corners of his mouth filled his generous face. There was no rank odor. There was no greasy feeling. There was only a delicacy that made people fall for it. Is this really pork? Why is it completely different from the pork I've eaten? This taste, it's crazy. Milo swallowed the red braised pork, felt the lingering fragrance between his lips and teeth, and began to deeply doubt his life. If the eggplant with garlic sauce brought him a surprise, then the red braised pork brought him a subversion. The subversion of his existing knowledge, the subversion of his so-called experience. After eating only a piece of red braised pork, he already knew that he had lost. He had lost completely. There was no problem with Randy's article. If there was a problem, it should be that he was still too restrained and calm. His article was not enough to really reflect the taste of the red braised pork. It was not inappropriate to call such a chef a genius to be able to turn a piece of streaky pork into such a delicious food. Milo turned his head and glanced at Meg, who was wantonly in the kitchen, with heartfelt admiration in his eyes. Such a chef was probably a real chef with ingenuity. He opened the kitchen so that everyone could see how the food in front of them was made. Between the fire and the smoke, his white clothes were not stained with oil, and he used the most elegant posture to cook the most delicious food. I think we have failed, Milo looked at Garland and said with a complicated expression. Chapter 1912. Garland, who tasted a piece of red braised pork, also had mixed feelings. They came with lofty ideals of fighting fraud. On the way, they discussed a lot of ways to fight fraud and even thought of the title of the article. They thought that Whole Foods and Beauty would rise again with this anti-fraud article, stepping on vegetarianism and meat-eating to become the #1 food magazine in the universe. But after arriving at Mamie's, everything was completely different from what they had imagined. The eggplant with garlic sauce, which was better than fish, really did exist. The red braised pork, made with fat streaky pork, was indeed delicious. As a senior food magazine editor-in-chief, his understanding of food was no worse than Milo's. His vision was even higher than Milo's. Mamie's was indeed the most special restaurant he had encountered in his career, or rather, in his entire life. If you didn't create something out of nothing and splash dirty water, you would never be able to write an article to find fault with it. Was the red braised pork not fragrant enough? Or was the eggplant with garlic sauce not enough? The comfortable dining environment, harmonious dining atmosphere, the gentle and appropriate service of the beautiful waitresses, and the space magician service were all things that were difficult for ordinary restaurants to do. Such a restaurant, unless you went against your conscience, how could you find fault with it? Milo was right. According to their original intention when they set out, they had failed, and they had failed miserably. It's impossible to fail. Tasting such delicious food is the greatest success. Garland quickly smiled and winked at Milo. Milo was slightly taken aback and immediately understood. Since they had come all the way here, they couldn't fight fraud. Couldn't they change their way of thinking to explore the restaurant? As a person who made a living by writing, this degree of flexibility was a basic quality. With this thought, Milo's mentality immediately changed. From the beginning, he was struggling to find fault with it, to enjoying the food and digging out points that were not written by Derek and Randy. Then he began a second creation. Of course, his purpose was not to stir up trouble, but to do a verification article. He already had a general idea in his mind. Although the gimmick might be weaker than fighting fraud, it would be a good trending article if he could ride on the popularity of vegetarianism and meat-eating, plus his own characteristics. Hello, here's your Buddha jumps over the wall. Not long after, Yabamiya walked over with a small cup and placed it in front of Garland. The small cup had a lid, which gave it a certain sense of mystery. Thank you. Garland thanked him and put down the chopsticks in his hand. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked at the small cup in front of him with a pious expression. Baldness was a very serious topic, and there was a perfect solution in front of him. He couldn't afford to be disrespectful. Milo also put down his chopsticks and looked expectantly at the quaint and heavy bowl. This dish had never been written by Derek or Randy. Taking a deep breath, Garland reached out and opened the lid of the small cup. Steam rose, bringing with it a faint mist. A rich, meaty aroma also blossomed along with it. Milo sniffed carefully. The freshness of the seafood was the most prominent, and the aroma of the meat was equally rich. The aroma of the wild mushrooms softened the aroma of the two, and there was also a faint wine aroma mixed in. There was a clear sense of hierarchy, and the taste of the various ingredients contended with each other. It was hard to fathom, but it also aroused an even stronger curiosity. Gulp. Milo couldn't help but gulp. It was hard to imagine that this was the aroma of a pot of soup. Regardless of whether it had the effect of curing baldness, Milo also wanted to taste a bowl of it just by smelling the fragrance. He wanted to personally taste what kind of taste the soup had, how many ingredients were hidden in it, and what kind of taste it had combined to form. The steam dissipated slightly, and the bowl of thick soup was also revealed. There were various ingredients in the thick soup. Abalone, chicken, shark's fin. They were visibly soft, but they still maintained their original state and didn't fall apart because of the stewing. The soup was thick but not muddy. It looked very tempting. Just by smelling the aroma, I feel like my hair is about to break out of its shell. Garland swallowed his saliva and couldn't wait to pick up the spoon. He scooped up a spoonful of brown soup, blew on it, and then put it into his mouth. The delicious soup slowly seeped into his taste buds. The freshness of the seafood, the mellowness of the meat, the taste of various ingredients appeared one by one, blooming on the tip of his tongue. There was a taste within a taste. The rich meat aroma was so ostentatious, but it was meaty, but not greasy. It was just right to make people want to take another bite. The soup slowly slid down his throat into his stomach and turned into a warm current. It slowly rose and then gathered at the top of his head. His scalp was slightly numb, and a trace of sweat appeared. There really is a feeling? Garland was surprised and happy. Although his hair didn't grow out immediately, he felt as if something wanted to break out of the top of his head. This feeling was so real. Milo had secretly swallowed a few times and asked Garland, "What's that smell?" "It's the smell of money." Garland nodded with a serious face. Then, he scooped up another spoonful of soup and put it into his mouth. He narrowed his eyes and enjoyed the feeling of the delicious soup flowing between his lips and teeth. This bowl of soup subverted all his imaginations about soup. Soup had always been a supporting role on the dining table, either as an appetizer or a supplement after meal. However, this Buddha jumps over the wall had the aura of an overlord, making all the dishes on the table pale in comparison. He could recognize many of the ingredients in the soup pot. Extremely fresh seafood meant that it was expensive, and precious mountain delicacies meant that it was rare. Just based on these ingredients alone, the Buddha jumps over the wall that cost 10,000 copper coins for a serving was already better than many restaurants in Rodu that relied on gimmicks to raise the price of their dishes. Moreover, the Buddha jumps over the wall had delicacies that they couldn't even dream of. "Let me try it too?" Milo couldn't hold it in anymore. He held his chopsticks and stared at the dishes in the small bowl eagerly. "This is medicine. How can you taste it so casually?" Garland picked up the small bowl and moved it in front of him. "I'll just try one mouthful, just one mouthful." Milo's gaze followed the movement of the Buddha jumps over the wall. "Not even one mouthful. Whether my hair can grow out depends on this small bowl of Buddha jumps over the wall. Look, even my head can feel it." Garland reached out his left hand to protect the small bowl and refused to budge an inch. Stingy. Milo glanced at Garland, who was sweating profusely. He didn't know if his head could really feel it, but he could only pick up a piece of red braised pork and put it into his mouth with some hidden bitterness. The red braised pork is really fragrant. After drinking a few mouthfuls of soup, Garland picked up a piece of crystalline shark's fin. The smooth shark's fin slid into his mouth almost instantly. The shark's fin that was soaked in the soup had a very strange texture and a wonderful taste. It was hard to tell whether it was there or not, but it was also very interesting. Chapter 1913. After drinking the entire cup of Buddha jumps over the wall soup, there was nothing left. Garland took out the towel that he always brought with him and wiped his sweaty bald head. Then he burped in satisfaction. Carefree. Garland felt that this was the most carefree meal he had eaten in the past 2 years. The Buddha jumps over the wall was the most delicious soup he had ever eaten in his life. Your hair really grew out? Milo glanced at Garland's head, and his eyes widened. He pointed at his head in surprise. Really? Milo was shocked. He reached out and touched his head. The top of his head was bare, but now it felt like there was some fine hair on it. Milo looked closer and nodded. A little fine hair has grown out. There's a lot of it. I think it'll work. Milo and Garland had known each other for more than 10 years. He had seen his head gradually expand from the hairline to the Mediterranean Sea. In the end, because he looked too much like a kappa, he could only compromise and become bald. This process was irreversible. He had only seen his hair fall off, but he had never seen it grow back. But now his hair had grown back on his bald head, and it was in the bald area in the center. Don't touch it. It'll be a loss if you touch it bald. Milo slapped Garland's hand away and picked up the bright silver spoon. Take a look for yourself. Garland held the spoon and looked for an angle for a while. Finally, he saw his shiny bald head in the spoon, as well as the faintly visible hair on his bald head. This is really fine hair. Good. My bald head is finally going to be reborn. Garland wept with joy. 2 lines of tears fell uncontrollably. He looked like a 60-year-old baby. Meg, who was in the kitchen, looked out and smiled. The joy of being a gourmet was so boring. I told you I didn't lie to you, Randy said with a smile. He had finished the mapo tofu, 2 bowls of rice, 2 rujiamos, and not a piece of braised pork left. Garland was overjoyed. He patted Randy on the shoulder and said, "Little brother Randy, you are really my benefactor. If Card Hill doesn't treat you well in the future, you can come to me. I'll cover you." Randy looked at Garland with some confusion. Card Hill was the chief editor of Carnivore. He was also the scary guy who urged him to update every day and sent him a 2-meter-long blade. However, he had just met these two, and he had never said that he was a gourmet. How did Garland know about Card Hill? And he wanted him to follow him? Milo kicked Garland under the table and signaled him to pay attention to his words with his eyes. Garland quickly realized that she had gotten carried away and blurted out some big words. She quickly changed the topic and said with a smile, "Aren't you a carnivorous gourmet? My house was actually right next to the Carnivorous magazine. Usually I would meet Cahill, that big fatty, when I was having breakfast. That guy is very stingy. He's not a good person, and he likes to rush you. So, I'm afraid that you'll suffer. If you really can't stand it, you can come with me." "I see. So you know Card Hill." Randy smiled and shook his head. "Thank you for your kindness, brother. However, being a gourmet isn't my main occupation anymore. It's just something I do out of interest." Milo and Garland looked at Garland with some surprise. "Aren't you on the rise now? Why don't you write about carnivore?" Milo couldn't help but ask. "Writing is so tiring. It's precarious. You are urged to write every day and have blades sent to you from time to time. You racked your brains to write it, but you are still criticized for being too short. Who are you looking down on? Who is short? You be the judge. Who is short? Although it is a little short, I have a long time. I have been doing this for so many years, right?" Randy sighed. Milo also sighed when he heard this. Who could say otherwise? Even though he attacked those merchants with heavy fists, he often looked at those heavy mailboxes and could only call them trash collectors. Fortunately, he had a good mentality. He relied on selling blades to get through the most difficult days. Sometimes, when he saw blades, he felt a sense of familiarity. So, I have changed to collecting rent now. There is a woman who is pestering me. She stuffed a lot of keys into my hands and asked me to collect rent for her. She was unhappy when I refused. Randy lifted the corner of his shirt and revealed a lot of keys.
He sighed.
Now I know that the lives of the rich are indeed simple and boring. Milo. Garland. I am done eating. I am going to collect rent again. I have to go back tonight and pay the public ration. Goodbye, brothers. Randy got up, paid the bill, and left, leaving the two of them in a mess in the wind, saying the toughest words and eating the softest rice. This is indeed a talent. Garland smacked her lips. Let's just be sour. Milo looked at Randy's departing figure. He didn't want to work hard anymore. Let's go. We have gained a lot today. We didn't come in vain. Garland got up and paid the bill. Are we going back just like that? Milo asked Garland after they walked out of the door. Of course not. I still have to eat 2 more courses of Buddha jumps over the wall. Garland shook her head and smiled. We're out for 3 days this time. Wouldn't it be a waste to go back in 1 day? Of course, we have to know more about this restaurant. Is our budget enough? Milo glanced at her from the corner of his eyes. When it comes to budget, there will always be enough. Garland didn't think much of it. Moreover, as long as we can write a really popular article, the boss will definitely reimburse us when we go back. We can just eat as much as we want. Then I am very much in favor of working for a few more days. It would be best if we can understand this restaurant from morning to night. Milo nodded. Are we going back to the hotel now? No, we're going around. I want to wait for Amy's to close before talking to the restaurant owner. Garland shook her head. Talk about what? Garland smiled and said, since we can't find fault with the article this time, it would be best if we can get the story behind the food. That way, we can distinguish ourselves from vegetarianism and meat eating. Otherwise, what difference would we be from those small magazines with no goals? They would just imitate and plagiarize like a swarm of bees. In the end, we can only drink the water used to wash our feet. Milo thought for a while and nodded. In terms of content control, Garland had a firm grasp. I think that hot pot looks good. Why don't we try it tomorrow? Milo's gaze was quickly attracted by the barbecue area next door. He looked at the demon who was eating while spitting fire. It was funny and interesting. It looked very worth a try. Chapter 1914. After the busy night's business ended, the girls returned to their dormitory. Meg, who was about to close the door, saw Milo and Garland standing outside. He remembered that these two had already had dinner and were waiting outside now. They must be waiting for him. These two were just ordinary people, so Meg was not in a hurry to close the door. Hello, boss. May I have a word with you? Garland stepped forward and smiled at Meg. I am Garland, the editor-in-chief of Whole Foods and Beauty magazine. I tasted your food today, and I was amazed. I would very much like to communicate with you. Whole Foods and Beauty. Meg frowned slightly. He had some impression of this magazine. He had browsed through the top magazines on the Norland continent before, and Whole Foods and Beauty was among them. What left a deep impression on him was not the magazine itself, but a gourmet named Milo. He was good at satire literature and used his poisonous tongue to diss all the big businesses. He was quite special in the gourmet articles. Of course, it was mainly because he reminded Meg of himself in the past. What a shameful past. However, compared to him, this little brother's skills were still a little lacking. His choice of words was obviously a little restrained. He was not at the level where he could control his words freely and was not free and unrestrained. Anyway, he was not as good as him. Moreover, he was thinking that if he had the chance to meet him, he would have to remind him to take it easy. After all, those chefs were mostly petty. If they were not careful, They could be cursed to the alternate world.
But chefs.
After all, not everyone was a son of Providence like him. Transmigrating to a different world, reaping a cute baby, and even being assigned a wife. Only he could encounter such a situation. Wait, Milo? Meg glanced at the tall, square-faced middle-aged man standing at the side. When he entered earlier, the omniscient door had popped up his information. His name was Milo. Could he be that little brother? Hello, I am Milo. I am a gourmet. Milo saw that Meg was looking at him, so he could only brace himself and greet him. He carefully observed the changes in Meg's expression. It was no secret that he had a bad reputation among the food and beverage industry. Hello, I'm Meg. It's nice to meet you. Meg smiled and nodded. He felt as if he had met someone of the same trade. He was very pleased that there were people in this world who could earn money while carrying a keyboard. This was such an inclusive world. Thank you. Milo was flattered. He muttered to himself that there was actually a restaurant owner who liked him. It was really surprising. What can I do for you? Meg looked at the two and asked. The two little guys were still waiting for him to tell them a story to coax them to sleep, so he didn't intend to welcome them in. Garland was also aware of Meg's hard work, so she went straight to the point. You may not know this, but under the publicity of several magazines in the same industry, Amy's and your several dishes have been loved by readers all over the world. After Milo and I tasted them, we were impressed by your cooking skills. We hope to have the opportunity to listen to you tell us the story behind these dishes in our free time. I think this is also what readers want to know. My influence is already so big? Meg looked at Garland in surprise. He knew that some of the restaurant's regular customers were gourmets. Randy, who had just hooked up with a rich woman, was one of them. But he didn't expect that the articles they wrote had already spread Amy's influence to all parts of the Norland continent. Yes, the charm of delicious food is irresistible. Your Amy's has already been regarded as a holy land in many people's hearts. Milo nodded. Although he had always scoffed at this so-called holy land this time, he very much agreed that Amy's could be promoted as a holy land. Meg looked at the two of them, and his mind spun quickly. Influence meant traffic, and to him, traffic meant fans that could be converted. In that case, let's talk again after tomorrow's business hours. It's a little late today, and the children need to sleep, Meg said with a smile. All right, then I won't disturb your rest. See you tomorrow. Garland quickly smiled as he watched the restaurant's door close slowly. Then he gave Milo a high five. Let's eat all we want tomorrow. We have enough funds. We came to the right place this time. Garland couldn't hide his excitement. Hee, then I won't stand on ceremony. Milo chuckled. He had always been good at taking advantage of the rich. Father, where's Mother? Isn't she coming back to sleep today? Amy asked as she sat on the high stool behind the counter, swinging her short legs as she hugged Ugly Duckling, who was already asleep, and stood at the side, and also looked at Meg. She might have something else to do today, and will be home later. Amy and can go to sleep first, okay? Meg said with a smile.
Okay.
Amy nodded obediently, and slid down from the high stool. Come on, let's go upstairs. Meg brought the two little fellows upstairs, and arranged for them to wash up first. When the two little fellows changed into their pajamas and lay on the bed, he started to tell them bedtime stories. What kind of story do you want to hear today? Meg asked the two little fellows as he sat on the bed and looked at them with anticipation. Amy raised her hand and said, I want to hear the story of the prince and the princess, and nodded as well. You're so young and you already know about the prince and the princess. That's not good. Meg stroked his chin. Most of the princes in fairy tales were arrogant and lascivious. For example, the prince who had designs on the unconscious Snow White, or the prince who was lustful and took the boots to look for Cinderella all over the world, or the prince who was blind and couldn't see the mermaid, and was even more of a jerk than Hong Shirxian. He had to give the two little girls the right values at the right age. He couldn't let them indulge in such unequal stories. Let's not talk about the prince and the princess today. Let's talk about the story of the pony crossing the river, okay? Meg said with a smile. Okay. Amy nodded, and immediately asked curiously, "Why did the pony cross the river?" It started from a stable. In this stable lived a mare and a beautiful pony. One day, the mare said to the pony, "You've grown up. Can you do something for your mother?" The pony jumped up and down and said, "Why not? I'm very willing to do something for you." The mare. Meg told the story in a gentle voice, and the two little fellows listened very seriously. The pony crossed the river. It turned out that the river was not as shallow as Old Cow said, and it was not as deep as Squirrel said. Meg ended the story. But the two little fellows continued to stare at him, not wearing any pajamas. The silence lasted for a while. And then, Amy couldn't help but ask, "Then, the pony crossed the river," Meg answered instinctively. "So the pony only crossed the river, and it became a story, and then it tried to trick us into sleeping?" Amy blinked. Meg muttered to himself. He realized that the little fellows were getting harder and harder to take care of. He could only imitate the tone of a primary school teacher and say, "So, what does this story tell us?" "You must learn to swim. That way, crossing the river will not become a story to trick children into sleeping," Amy said with a serious face. Chapter 1915. The night was getting late. In the city lord's castle of Chaos City, the meeting hall was brightly lit, and the various representatives looked very serious. Everyone had already gone to that cave together and saw the destroyed seal and the ruins left behind by a fierce battle. They could confirm that a devil had broken free from the seal and was missing. Furthermore, Rankster must have had a battle with that devil, but the outcome was unknown. His corpse was not found at the scene. This was undoubtedly very bad news. Everyone had already seen how scary the devil was. Even 10th-tier powerhouses couldn't kill it. If it wasn't for Alex summoning the lightning and the spell formation masters from the Moon Nation helping to repair the seal's spell formation, the Great Old One in the Thunderstorm Mountains would have already caused harm to the human world. But now that a devil had broken free from the seal and was missing, it had undoubtedly become the most unstable factor on the Norland continent. An uncontrollable existence was undoubtedly the most dangerous. The tragedy of Yerba tribe was still in everyone's memory. No one wanted their tribe to suffer the same tragedy. Douglas broke the silence. "We have to find it as soon as possible. Otherwise, no one will be able to live in peace. The problem now is, how are we going to find it?" Irina looked at him. "Rankster is from your Frost Dragon tribe. He's the only one who knows where the devil is now. We have lost contact with Rankster for 3 years. I don't know where to find him now." Douglas shook his head. This was no longer something that the Frost Dragons could bear. The various representatives spoke one after another, and their emotions became more and more agitated. However, they still couldn't come up with a useful solution. "There's no point in arguing. The devil's existence is already a threat to all of us. Facing such a formidable enemy, we can only win if we unite as one." Michael interrupted the argument that was starting to turn into an argument. "Michael, what do you suggest?" Lewis asked Michael. The various representatives also looked at Michael, who was the host. Michael seriously said, "It's not realistic to look for a hidden devil all over the world. If it's the other half of the devil in the Thunderstorm Mountains, then it's very likely to break the seal and release the devil in the Thunderstorm Mountains. I think we should form a strong enough backup team to be ready to deal with the devil that might appear in the Thunderstorm Mountains. At the same time, we should set up a sealing spell formation near the seal so that we can lure the devil into the spell formation and seal it again if we can't kill it." The various representatives nodded thoughtfully. "We need the spell formation masters from the Moon Nation to rebuild the seal. Why aren't they here?" Sean. "This is a calamity for all of the races on the Norland continent. She's doing well on the moon, and helping you is an act of kindness. If she doesn't help you, then it's her duty. How shameless are you to think she'd be so thick-skinned as to come here and join in the fun?" Irina looked at Sean with a cold sneer. Sean's expression changed slightly. Displeasure flashed across his eyes. He snorted. You know this concerns the safety of all the races on the Norland continent. What's the use of saying such sarcastic words? In my opinion, the biggest threat to the Norland continent now is not a devil, but the million-strong cavalry of the Roth Empire. I would like to ask, if all the races work together to subdue and seal that devil, will the Roth Empire renew the peace treaty at the peace conference? Irina asked coldly, as she looked at Sean. The various representatives kept quiet as they looked between the two of them. After Alex cut off one of Alex's ears and left a must-kill declaration, the feud between Alex and Irina and the royal family of the Roth Empire was brought to the table. Irina and Alex were not good people. From the time Irina came out of seclusion to Alex's reappearance, the people who appeared on that rainy night back then were dying one after another. Now, the only possibility left was the royal family of the Roth Empire that led all of this back then. And the Roth Empire had grown into a colossus in these 100 years. Compared to the scattered races of the giant dragons, the Roth Empire was completely controlled by Andre. Be it the million-strong cavalry or the countless magic casters under the Magus Tower, they already had a scale and power that all the races feared. The peace conference was going to start in a few days' time. Andre's ambition to rule the world was obvious. If the Norland continent were to descend into a racial war again, that missing devil would indeed not be so important anymore. Sean's frown deepened. This question was obviously not something that he could give a clear answer to. Before he came, Andre had not given him a clear answer either. He knew what Andre wanted. He wanted the world to belong to the Roth Empire, and he wanted all the races to bow down to the Roth Empire, or even become their slaves. That was what he thought too. However, he could not say such things now. Andre would never allow him to say such a stupid answer. The Roth Empire is willing to join forces with all the races to deal with the devil. This is for the benefit of the Norland continent. As for the peace conference, we have our own demands. Whether we will renew the peace agreement or not is not up to us. It is up to the attitude of all the races, Sean said in a low voice. He was still rather calm despite being surrounded by a group of 10th-tier big shots. If what Josh said is true, then all of you are dreaming, Lewis scolded mercilessly. Sean glanced at Lewis and calmly said, the Roth Empire has always been pragmatic. We will not fight a war we are not prepared for, nor will we make demands that we cannot fulfill. The expressions of the various representatives changed slightly. They looked at Sean with a complicated gaze. They had to admit that the 100 years of peace had brought unparalleled prosperity and development to the Roth Empire. Until now, it was still giving them a headache. Are you too arrogant, or am I too weak to lift my sword? At this moment, a mocking voice sounded from outside the meeting hall. Everyone looked in the direction of the door instinctively. The door of the meeting hall opened slowly on both sides. A man wearing a black warrior suit and a mask walked in slowly, with a heavy sword on his back. Alex. Sean's eyes lit up, and he clenched his fists instinctively. The 10th-tier powerhouse beside him also stared at the door warily and started to get closer to Sean. I'm here to bring my wife home, and at the same time, give the poser a slap in the face. Everyone, do you mind? Meg's voice still had a tinge of mockery. Chapter 1916. They didn't mind. Of course they didn't mind. If not for their status, many of them would have taught this poser a lesson. The Edward family's posers were each more annoying than the other. However, there was always one thing to overcome another. As long as they met Alex, they would be like frosted eggplants and wouldn't dare to show their faces. The representatives of the other races might have to consider Sean's status and the interests of their own race. But Alex didn't want that. He was a loner now, and an extremely powerful loner. He could do whatever he wanted without any scruples. Josh's ear was cut off just like that, and he even threatened him with death, but the Roth Empire didn't say anything. Therefore, when Sean was putting on a show, Alex appeared here at the right time. Meg was really here to fetch his wife. He had just coaxed the two children to sleep and saw that Irina wasn't back yet. He thought that he should show his face at such an important moment, so he came to the city lord's castle. It was a coincidence that he met Sean putting on a show. However, since he had bumped into him, he naturally couldn't let him put on a show so easily. Although Sean didn't take part in the attack on that rainy night directly back then, he played a part in the military silence. Furthermore, in the past 3 years, he had been sending people to look for him, fearing that he wasn't completely dead. Naturally, he wasn't a good person. Sean, who was targeted by Meg, retracted his fist from the table unnaturally. His eyes were still as dangerous as before, but now there was a hint of enmity. Alex was even more powerful now than he had been back then. And after defeating and sealing the devil, his status in the Roth Empire, and even in the hearts of the people of the entire Norland continent, had risen to an extremely high position. Alex, long time no see. Sean looked at Meg with a smile, as if he had seen an old friend. You don't have to pretend to be familiar with me. You and I are at most enemies. Even if I don't kill you today, I won't welcome you with a smile. Meg sneered mercilessly. The smile on Sean's face froze instantly.
Great.
The eyebrows of the various representatives gradually relaxed, and they felt much better. Irina also looked at Meg with a smile. She didn't expect that his eloquence was getting better and better. He seemed to have inherited some of her skills. Although the expert beside Sean couldn't hide his anger, he didn't dare to speak rashly. Sean looked at Meg and said, You may have misunderstood what happened back then, but I'm not in a position to say too much. Now our common enemy is the devil. I hope you can put aside your old grudges and join forces with us to kill the devil that escaped from the seal, or reseal it. He quickly regained his composure. You might have some misunderstandings about the misunderstanding. You and I both know what happened back then, but I really won't kill you now. It won't be too late to settle the score after the peace talks between the demons and us, Meg said with a smile. Sean's face darkened. Alex, since you're here, why don't we sit down and discuss a plan? After all, you and Princess Irina discovered this cave.
What do you think about this?
Michael said with a smile, interrupting the tense atmosphere. What Irina said is what I want to say. Meg glanced in Irina's direction and then continued, I don't know where to find it now, but it's definitely right to set up a new seal spell formation as soon as possible. Michael nodded and said, In that case, I'll personally visit the Princess of the Moon Nation at Mamie's tomorrow. I heard that she has already returned to Mamie's today. In that case, you guys take your time. We'll be taking our leave now. Meg walked over to Irina's side and extended his hand to her. Let's go. Okay? Irina's lips curled up slightly, and she reached out to grab Meg's hand and walked out of the door. The various representatives looked on with complex expressions as they disappeared from the conference hall, and all of them were a little resentful. No one had expected to be stuffed with dog food in the middle of such a tense meeting. Sean also heaved a sigh of relief, and he relaxed his tightly clenched fists. He leaned back in his chair gently, and only then did he realize that his clothes were already soaked in sweat. Tisifest, you're here to take your wife home? After leaving the city lord's castle, Irina looked at Meg with a smile. Yes, there's nothing wrong with it. Meg took off his mask and also looked at Irina with a smile, but he didn't let go of her hand. Where are the 2 little ones? I just coaxed them to sleep, and then I came to pick you up, Meg said honestly. Well, they did well. Irina nodded. Are you hungry? Meg asked gently, Do you want to eat something?
Yes.
Irina nodded very frankly and seriously thought about it and said, I want to eat hot pot. Beef rolls, lamb rolls, tripe, pig's brain, and so on. I want all of them. Do you want to eat hot pot now? Yes, I haven't had dinner today, and the box meals at the city lord's castle are terrible. Irina nodded, and her eyes flashed with innocence. Okay, I'll make it for you later. Meg's heart instantly melted, and he agreed with a smile. Irina directly sent the 2 of them back to the restaurant with a teleportation. Take a seat first, I'll go and prepare the hot pot base. Meg poured a cup of warm water for Irina and turned to go into the kitchen. Meg had left some of the thick bone broth for Irina to drink alone, but it was just right for the hot pot broth now. Not long after, Meg came out of the kitchen with a double-flavored hot pot. Then, He came out with 2 large trays, which were neatly arranged with various dishes and a specially made dipping sauce. Irina's taste was relatively light, and the red soup was slightly spicy. It was the Lady Boss's special version, and Meg made it according to her taste. It was more flavorful than the clear soup, but it would not make her feel uncomfortable. First, put in some beef rolls and lamb rolls, and then cook the vegetables in the soup. Irina took the trays and directly put them into the hot pot, and did not forget to remind Meg, "I'll leave the tripe and duck intestines to you." "Okay, I promise to make the most delicious tripe and duck intestines for you." Meg smiled and picked up a duck intestine with his long chopsticks and dipped it in and out of the boiling soup. The thinly sliced lamb rolls and beef rolls were cooked very quickly, and Irina dipped them in the dipping sauce one by one, and then put them into her mouth. The thinly sliced lamb covered in chili oil was dipped in the dipping sauce to cool down for a short time, and then put into her mouth, just enough to release the perfect taste and temperature. Irina's face rippled with a satisfied smile, and her chopsticks picked up slices of beef and lamb rolls, and her mouth made very light and cheerful chewing sounds. As long as she ate fast enough, the lamb and beef in the pot would never get old. Meg dipped the cooked duck intestines in the dipping sauce with his long chopsticks, and then put it in the small bowl in front of Irina. Irina picked up the duck intestines and put them into her mouth, making crisp chewing sounds. Her beautiful eyes curved into a crescent moon as she nodded and said, "Delicious." Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 1917. "It smells so good." A groggy voice came from the staircase. Irina and Meg, who were eating happily, froze at the same time and turned to look at the staircase. Amy stood at the staircase, rubbing her sleepy eyes, and looked at them with squinted eyes. Ugly Duckling yawned as it missed its footing and rolled down the table. Its head crashed into the corner of the table, and it looked up at Mag with a dumbfounded expression as it called out to Mag, "Hey," and also poked her head out from behind the staircase and looked curiously at the steaming hot pot on the table with her bright eyes. "Father, Mother, you're eating supper behind our backs again. And it's hot pot." Perhaps it was because the aroma was too alluring, but Amy suddenly woke up and said angrily, Meg's smile was a little awkward. Irina picked up a piece of beef roll and smiled at Amy and said, "You're awake. Do you want to come over and eat with us?" "Sure." Amy's angry face immediately broke into a smile, and she skipped over to take a bite of the beef roll. She chewed happily and seemed to have forgotten all about her anger. She didn't forget to praise, "The beef is so delicious." Meg looked at Amy, who was eating happily, with a complicated expression. Indeed, the best way to appease a foodie was to stuff her mouth with good food. It was faster and more convenient than explaining anything. "And come over and eat something too." Meg waved at Anne and walked over quietly and sat down on the chair beside Meg. "Here, cook as you see fit. I'll make 2 dipping sauces for you." Meg gave her a new pair of chopsticks with a smile and got up to walk to the kitchen. Other than the dipping sauces, he still had to add more dishes. Once Amy started eating, her battle prowess was no less than Irina's. "Father, I want my dipping sauce to be spicier." "This hot pot isn't spicy at all," Amy said to Meg's back. "All right." Meg's voice came from the kitchen. As a young contestant who could handle insanely spicy food, this level of spiciness was indeed not enough for Amy. While eating hot pot, Meg went to grill some crayfish and oysters. Although it wasn't healthy to eat supper late at night, the whole family was sitting in front of the hot pot, eating the hot pot and barbecued meat at the same time. The feeling of joy and harmony was really delicious. Amy didn't forget to remind Mag and Irina seriously when she got down from the table after she was full. "I'll let it go this time, but you have to remember to invite me for supper next time," she reminded them seriously. "Okay, next time for sure." Meg nodded with a smile. Meow. Ugly Duckling let go of the lobster's shell and meowed. "Count me in." After getting Amy's permission to let go of itself, Ugly Duckling became rounder and rounder. and, on the other hand, had learned from Irina's elegance and calmness. She put down her chopsticks and waited quietly at the side. However, judging from the slight smile on her face, she still liked this supper very much. All right, go upstairs and play for a while before you sleep. You just finished eating, so you can't lie on the bed. Meg waved his hand and chased the two little fellows upstairs. The amusement park could help them digest some of the supper. Meanwhile, he started to clear the table. Irina helped Meg clear the table and asked casually, "Sean, what do you plan to do with him?" Meg shook his head. "We can't kill him now. If he dies, it'll be equivalent to directly pushing Josh to the throne. Then we'll kill them together. If we kill them both, Andre will probably start a war that will sweep across the entire continent immediately. Moreover, it'll be a hysterical kind that doesn't care about the consequences. Then we'll kill Andre as well." Meg smiled. "You know, he's the most difficult person to kill in this world. That old tortoise." Irina pursed her lips, but she had to admit that Meg was right. "Young master, what are you looking for?" An old butler asked helplessly as he followed behind Harrison and watched him rummage through the cabinets and clothes scattered all over the floor. "I'm looking for my black jacket. It's the one that makes me look especially skinny." Harrison stuck his head out of the cabinet and said to the old butler, "Do you know where it is?" As a person who was about to go on his first date tomorrow, Harrison was indeed a little nervous. In order to leave a good impression on Georgina, he had set a lot of requirements for his image, including his clothes. However, he was very dissatisfied with his bloated self in the bronze mirror after trying on many clothes. He asked the maid to look for his favorite black jacket for a long time, but he still couldn't find it, so he had to look for it himself. "Are you talking about the black jacket you wore 10 years ago?" the old butler asked. Yes. "Do you know where it is?" Harrison's eyes lit up. "You threw it away 9.5 years ago because you couldn't fit it." The old butler shook his head. "You were only 150 kilograms when it was custom-made. Even if you kept it until now, you wouldn't be able to fit it. So it's like this." Harrison was a little disappointed. It turned out that the handsome young man in his impression wasn't because of the black jacket, but because he had lost weight back then, too. "Look, this was custom-made for you later. When you were 250 kilograms, if you squeeze it a little, this jacket might fit." The old butler found a black jacket in the pile of clothes on the floor. "Come, let's try it." Harrison's interest was reignited. With the help of the old butler, he reluctantly squeezed his huge body into this jacket that clearly did not fit him. This is really a distressing stomach. He managed to put the jacket on. Apart from the fact that he couldn't move his hands, his stomach that was as tight as a jar was also very eye-catching. "Young master, just wear something comfortable. There's no need to make yourself look so pathetic." The butler looked at Harrison. "If the girl likes you, it's definitely not because of your looks, but because of your interesting soul." "That's true." Harrison chuckled, but his expression soon froze. He looked at the old butler and said suspiciously, "I feel like you're scolding me." "Why would I? I watched you grow up. Let's wear this tomorrow. Your soul will look more interesting." The butler found a long shirt with a little duck embroidered on the chest from the pile of clothes. "Young ladies like this kind of fresh style. Isn't that what you said back then?" "All right, then I'll wear this tomorrow." Harrison nodded. He felt that his old butler was quite reliable sometimes. "Is my soul really interesting?" Harrison asked again when the old butler left the room. "They all say that good-looking looks are all the same, but interesting souls weigh 150 kilograms. You fit the criteria very well." The old butler nodded seriously. Chapter 1918. Chaos City was a complicated city.
It was a city that stood out from the rest.
People from various races came here and built this city of freedom and equality together under the constraints and guidance of a special set of rules. The Roth Empire was still consolidating its centralized feudal dynasty. The Wind Forest gave up its free soul and became more and more like humans. They dug deep caves to guard against the next racial war. The orcs still maintained their nomadic hunting tradition. The demons kept fighting for territory. The giant dragons soared in the sky, but had the strictest racial suppression. Chaos City, on the other hand, kept opening up and innovating. It went from a wasteland and a prison for war criminals to a thriving city in the past 100 years. Milo and Garland got up shortly after dawn. They carried their small bags and walked on the streets of Chaos City. They looked at the breakfast shops that opened one after another. As the steam rose, they saw the smiles on the faces of those who woke up early. This was a lively city. Such a lively city was not common in Rodu. Those who lived at the bottom and could not change their lives no matter how hard they tried. There was no anticipation or passion for life on their faces. But in Chaos City, you could see the smiles on people's faces everywhere. Even if they only bought a pancake from the roadside for 1 copper coin, they could still eat it and feel that it was extraordinarily delicious. Happiness was probably the most charming and attractive aspect of this city. I used to think that this city didn't even have good food and that the people living here must not be happy. But now, it seems that this thinking was too narrow-minded. Milo smiled shamefully.
Yes.
If I hadn't come here personally, I wouldn't have thought that this city's happiness would be so strong. Garland nodded in agreement. Moreover, there's a restaurant in this city that all foodies in the world envy and yearn for. I'm more curious about what Amy's breakfast will be like now, Milo said with a smile. Today might be a very memorable day in his career. He would be interviewing a restaurant owner for the first time about the story behind the food. In the past, he would always fill in the 10,000-word dirty stories for those bosses. Milo and Garland had arrived early enough, but they did not expect that there were already scattered customers lining up at the entrance of Amy's. In addition, there were also many cleaners gathered at the entrance of the restaurant. It seemed that they were also waiting for food. Will Amy's breakfast prices be lowered? Milo asked the customer standing in front of him curiously. That customer seemed to have seen through Milo's thoughts and explained with a smile, the prices on the menu won't change. Boss Mag has been preparing breakfast for the cleaners for a while so that they can have a steaming hot breakfast after working for a few hours. I see. Mr. Mack is really a good person. Milo nodded thoughtfully. With the high price of Mamie's dishes, preparing breakfast for so many cleaners every day was not a small expense. What was even more difficult was that he had to prepare breakfast before opening every day, which would undoubtedly take up his rest time. Not long after, the door of the restaurant opened, and a female employee walked out with a big iron bucket in one hand. She began to distribute the congee with pork and century egg to the cleaners in an orderly manner. The hot steam carried the aroma of the congee with pork and century egg and spread in all directions. It smells so good. Milo's throat rolled as he looked at the cleaners who were carrying large bowls of congee with pork and century egg. He muttered, I suddenly want to be a cleaner. If it's just you, maybe they won't want you. Garland glanced at him. For breakfast, Milo ordered a bowl of congee with pork and century egg. He also followed the advice of the customer at the same table and ordered a set of soy milk and youtiao. The congee with pork and century egg had refreshed his imagination of porridge. He didn't know what kind of animal had laid the century egg, but it was so delicious when paired with tender lean meat. After a bowl of congee with pork and century egg, he only felt that his whole body had become warm. The combination of youtiao and soy milk had subverted all his imagination of breakfast. The crispy youtiao was crispy and fragrant. It was better than any fried snack. It also had a hint of sweetness. The more he chewed, the more delicious it became. He took another sip of the sweet and delicious soy milk. The texture was much more delicate and soft than milk. After swallowing, his mouth was still full of fragrance. Of course, this was not the ultimate way to eat. He picked up the short strips of youtiao with chopsticks and dipped them into the soy milk. When the youtiao was slightly soft, he immediately picked it up and took a bite. The youtiao, with a hint of tenacity in its softness, was tainted with the sweetness of the soy milk. Whether it was the texture or the layers of taste, it had increased countless times, becoming a brand new delicacy. After drinking the last drop of soy milk in the bowl, Milo put down his chopsticks and couldn't help but praise, Mr. Mack is really a genius to be able to come up with such a wonderful combination. I agree with that very much. Garland also put down the bowl, somewhat unsatisfied. No wonder Randy and the others don't want to leave here. It's not because they don't have goals or ideals, but because they don't want to leave. This is simply heaven. Milo looked in the direction of the kitchen. Meg's body seemed to be exuding a mysterious glow. After the morning service, Milo and Garland were received by Meg. "Is this considered an interview?" Meg said with a smile as he poured a cup of tea for Milo and Garland each. Speaking of which, this is the first time we've interviewed a chef. If you've read our magazine, you should know that we're always serious and critical when it comes to food, Garland said with a smile. In that case, I should feel honored. No, it's our honor to be able to ask Mr. Mack to talk about the story behind food. For breakfast today, we were once again impressed by your exquisite culinary skills and novel and special ideas, Garland quickly said. He didn't want to leave an arrogant impression on Meg. Meg looked at Garland with a smile and said, "Before the interview begins, may I take the liberty to ask about the influence of Whole Foods and Beauty magazine? For example, the number of subscribers to the new issue?" Garland was a little surprised by Meg's question, but he quickly smiled and said, "Whole Foods and Beauty is the leader in the food magazine industry. After decades of development, it has become one of the most influential food magazines on the Norland continent. The number of new issues released every month is tens of thousands of copies, and the radiation affects hundreds of thousands of people, which is equivalent to about 10 million. Even Princess Vanessa of the Roth Empire is a loyal reader of our magazine. She even wrote to me," Milo added with a smile. "She seems to read all kinds of food magazines and occasionally writes to some gourmets who she thinks might have problems with their livelihood, encouraging them to persevere," Meg said calmly as he glanced at Milo. Milo. Garland's gaze was a little shifty as he tried hard not to laugh. Vanessa said that herself. She had been doing this kind of thing all these years and occasionally gave some money to these gourmets so that they could get through some difficult times. In this world where entertainment was scarce and information circulation was inconvenient, it was already very good that a food magazine could do this. Meg knew that Garland's so-called radiation of 1 million was definitely a little exaggerated, but the sales of tens of thousands of magazines were real. This meant that as long as he accepted the interview, this interview would appear in the new issue of those readers who bought the magazine. "What do you want to ask?" Meg poured himself a cup of tea, leaned back in his chair, and sat comfortably. "Then, can we start with Mr. Meg's culinary experience? Mr. Meg has such amazing culinary skills at such a young age, and keeps creating so many delicacies. You must be born in a family of chefs, and have been learning to cook since you were young, right?" Garland asked with a smile. "Not really." Meg shook his head and calmly said, "Being a chef is just a hobby. I haven't learned cooking from anyone, and I don't have any family background of chefs. A few months ago, I felt that I should raise the level of this world's food, so I opened this restaurant." Garland. Milo. The two of them looked at Meg with a somewhat inexplicable gaze. "Not bad, big-chested brother." This pretentious act made people not know how to respond. Originally, they thought that Mr. Mack seemed to be easy to get along with, and the interview should be carried out in a relaxed and pleasant atmosphere. They did not expect that as soon as they sat down, Mr. Mack directly laid his cards on the table. Meg looked at the expressions of the two, and was a little puzzled. Was he too simple? After all, Garland was a professional chief editor. She quickly realized that Meg's way of speaking made it easier to ignite the topic, so she followed his words and continued, "You said that you want to raise the level of this world's food. What do you mean by that?" "Let more people eat real delicacies instead of those ordinary foods. Let those fake delicacies have nowhere to hide, improve people's ability to appreciate delicacies, and even let every ordinary person learn 1 or 2 delicacies that they can cook themselves." Meg smiled slightly. "This is my vision and also my so-called higher level of food." Milo opened his mouth slightly and looked at Meg with eyes full of surprise and appreciation. How could this not be what he thought in his heart? "This is really a great and beautiful vision." Garland praised sincerely. As a food lover, she also looked forward to seeing such a grand scene. You have created so many strange and delicious foods. May I ask where your inspiration comes from? You have to know that many of these foods are unheard of. We can't even imagine that they can be cooked like this, such as beggar's chicken wrapped in mud or tofu pudding made with soybeans. Meg smiled and said, I can only be regarded as a person who stands on the shoulders of wise ancestors, and life is the source of all inspiration. What you don't know doesn't exist, but your knowledge is limited. Chapter 1919. What Meg said was the truth. He wasn't willing to give all the credit to himself. He had merely obtained a recipe that had been optimized by countless seniors and studied and practiced diligently enough. However, when Garland and Milo heard this, they felt that it was much more pretentious. On the surface, Meg seemed to be humble, but from another perspective, it felt like he was mocking those chefs who didn't know how to adapt. Garland glanced at Milo and wanted to know how an old thousand-layer cake would view this paragraph. Milo raised his eyebrows and expressed that this pretentious act was on point. It would definitely infuriate those arrogant chefs and increase the discussion in the magazine. I've tasted the Buddha jumps over the wall that you cooked yesterday. It's so delicious that it's unforgettable. It even made my hair grow out again after being bald for more than 10 years. May I ask how you created such a miraculous delicacy that's both delicious and can grow hair at the same time? You have to know that many of the seafood in this dish are very difficult to obtain in Chaos City. Garland continued to ask a question that he was very curious about. Meg glanced at Garland's head. His bald head was indeed like a forest after the rain, with some fine hair growing out. Judging from his experience, he nodded slightly and said, You still need to eat 2 more courses and rest well at the same time to let it grow back properly.
All right.
Garland quickly nodded and followed the doctor's instructions. Meg and Garland looked at each other and suddenly realized that something wasn't quite right. Sorry, it's an occupational disease. Meg touched his nose awkwardly. You're a real good doctor, Garland said seriously. As a chef, making delicious food is the most basic pursuit. However, what other effects will appear after the deliciousness is achieved is not something I can control. Meg shook his head. Therefore, the fact that Buddha jumps over the wall can treat baldness was not known when I was researching this dish. It was an unexpected surprise that the customers discovered after this dish was launched. Garland pondered. Perhaps this is the reward for the deliciousness. That's an interesting direction of explanation. Meg smiled too. The interview was carried out in a relaxed atmosphere. The questions that Garland chose were not too tricky, and Meg basically answered everything he knew, making the work of both parties much easier. About an hour later, Garland looked at Meg and thanked him. Thank you very much for accepting our interview and letting us know the stories behind the food. I believe that more people will fall in love with Mamis and become your fans after watching this interview. You're welcome. Meg smiled. He actually liked the feeling of sharing his success. It felt like acting tough? Oh, this way of saying it is too tacky. It should be sharing happiness. Garland had asked all the questions that he should ask. As the chief editor of a gourmet magazine, he still had his own opinions about chefs. When will this article be published? Meg asked curiously. The article will be published in the new issue at the end of the month, Garland replied with a smile. In fact, the content of the new issue had all been finalized and even handed over to the printing workshop. But Garland changed his mind after the interview. He planned to add the new manuscript written by Milo and this exclusive interview to the new issue and set it as the main article. In the past few months, Total Eclipse and American cuisine had not had a good time under the attack of carnivore and vegetarianism. This would be a turnaround battle that would determine the outcome. Meg nodded and changed the topic. Does your magazine have a column that teaches people how to cook? Garland and Milo both looked at Meg with some doubts. It's a column that does gourmet tutorials, Meg explained. Garland understood and shook his head. Not at the moment. You should know that the recipe is the most important thing for a chef. Generally, it is not easily shared with others, let alone published in a widely circulated magazine. Meg nodded slightly. From a chef's point of view, this idea was not difficult to understand. However, it was precisely because of this inherent closed mind that the speed of innovation of gourmet food was extremely slow and the overall level of gourmet food was stagnant. I want to open a gourmet tutorial column in Total Eclipse and American Cuisine. Meg looked at Garland and said seriously, Garland stared blankly for a moment before revealing a look of ecstasy. Even her voice was trembling as she said, "You're saying that you want to open a gourmet tutorial column in Whole Food Mart, specifically for gourmet education?" Milo also looked at Meg with a look of surprise. He couldn't believe his ears.
Yes.
Meg nodded. "I will publish an easy-to-learn home-cooked recipe in every issue so that readers can learn from the article." Garland quickly calculated the benefits that this would bring to Total Eclipse and American Cuisine. With Mamie's current reputation, if they could get an exclusive tutorial column, then Total Eclipse would become the overlord of the entire gourmet magazine industry, completely crushing vegetarianism and carnivory. If Mr. Meg has such an idea, Total Eclipse will fully cooperate and support your column and will pay you a generous remuneration. Garland looked at Meg solemnly and said. Meg said quite straightforwardly, "Then let's talk about the specific details of the cooperation. The opening of the column is not in a hurry. After your new issue is released this month, you can decide when to publish the gourmet tutorial based on the market feedback. At that time, you can make a preview in the new issue of this month. Maybe you can achieve a better effect." "Your proposal is very good. We will implement it." Garland took out a small notebook and wrote it down. Raising expectations was their usual method, but it was the first time they made a preview, but it sounded very feasible. Regarding the gourmet tutorial, Meg and the others talked for another half an hour and basically finalized all the details of the cooperation. "Mr. Meg, are you really not willing to sign an exclusive licensing agreement with us? We'll give you the most generous remuneration for your work, and we'll do our best to promote your work. I guarantee that your fame and benefits will be maximized." Garland looked at Meg with anticipation in his eyes. "Exclusive means monopoly. My dream is to make no difficult dishes in the world, not to earn a little remuneration." Meg smiled and shook his head. "Okay, we respect your wishes." Garland nodded. Although he had some regrets, he did not pursue it further. "Mr. Mack, if you have any difficulties in writing, you can write to me. Although I dare not say that I am an expert in this area, I am an old writer who has been writing for more than 10 years. Milo said with a smile. "Okay." Meg nodded with a smile, but in his heart, he secretly criticized. "When it comes to writing manuscripts, you are still a brother among brothers." Chapter 1920. Meg sent Milo and Garland away, put away the tea set, and went to the study on the second floor to start thinking about how to write the first gourmet tutorial. Magazines, as the most widely disseminated paper media in the world, were the simplest and most effective way to expand influence. Although he had recently begun to study how to reduce the production cost of Magic Vision and how to make it smaller and more homely, there was still a long way to go to promote it into an entertainment tool that every household liked. But spending a dozen copper coins to buy a magazine, in addition to being able to read all kinds of gossip in the gourmet world, he could also learn a top gourmet recipe. Wasn't that great? What Meg wanted was not popularity, nor influence, but true apprentice fans who could provide him with the power of faith. He wanted to use the good platform of Whole Foods and delicacies to gain more fans and let more people learn to cook from him, achieve the effect of promoting gourmet food, and at the same time, let him continue to increase his fan base. As for why he refused to sign an exclusive contract, this involved Meg's greater ambition. A top gourmet magazine may have 1 million fans, then what about 10? Excluding the duplicates, there were at least 5 million fans. And jumping out of the small pool of gourmet magazines, if he cooperated with more influential gossip magazines with a wider audience, he would inevitably be able to reach more fans. He really didn't care about the royalties of the magazine. Doing something was not as easy and pleasant as writing for money. "You have to treat today." If you get Mr. Mac, whole foods and delicacies will take off. Milo patted Garland's shoulder heavily, and his face could not hide the excitement. It's a pity that we didn't get the exclusive. Garland sighed, but the smile on her face could not be hidden. This was indeed an unexpected surprise. Originally, she thought that being able to interview Meg was already very good, and the next issue would be hot. She did not expect that after the interview, she would even get Meg's gourmet tutorial column, and a promotion and a raise were just around the corner. Speaking of which, Mr. Mac is really a great chef. Ordinary chefs can't wait to hide their recipes and take them to their coffins, but he's willing to share the recipes he created for free. Moreover, he's sharing them with food lovers all over the world in a magazine, Milo praised. Garland also stopped smiling and said with some admiration, yes, he said that he wants to improve the level of food in this world. It's not just a casual remark. He really wants to do something, and he even took out the most precious thing for it. Princess Barbara, may I have a word with you? Michael came to the ice cream shop and found Barbara, who was serving ice cream to children, with a smile. Wait a minute. Barbara handed the ice cream to the children and turned to look at Michael. Is there anything I can help you with? Michael glanced at the children beside him and then looked at Barbara. Why don't we talk outside? Okay. Barbara nodded and followed Michael out of the ice cream shop to a relatively secluded part of the park. I'm sorry to disturb your work, but it's an emergency. I hope Princess Barbara won't blame me, Michael said apologetically as he stood beside the bench. It's okay. Go ahead. Barbara had a good impression of Michael. Princess Barbara is someone who has fought with us, so I won't hide it from you. The devil has appeared again, and it has escaped the seal. Michael went straight to the point. Escaped? Barbara was shocked. She had not completely eliminated the shadow of that devil, and she was really shocked to hear this news. It's not the one at the Thunderstorm Mountains. Alex and Irina found a new sealed place under Dragon Island, but the seal has been destroyed, and the great old one sealed inside is also missing. Michael shook his head. In other words, there's a devil right beside us now. Barbara's eyes widened, and she looked around instinctively. Don't worry too much. If it appeared in Chaos City, we would definitely be able to find its tracks very quickly. The biggest problem now is that we can't confirm its location, Michael consoled with a smile. Then, why did you come to look for me, City Lord? Although I'm quite powerful, I still don't have much hope of defeating a devil. Barbara looked at Michael perplexedly. What we're more worried about now is that the devil will go to the Thunderstorm Mountains, destroy the seal there, rescue that octopus monster, and merge with it again. When that happens, we might be facing an invincible opponent. Michael's expression gradually became serious. So, on behalf of Chaos City and all the races on the Norland continent, I would like to request the Moon Nation to help us and help us build another sealing spell formation in the Thunderstorm Mountains. When that devil appears, we can design a way to seal it again. Barbara understood now. She nodded after thinking for a while and said, I will pass these words to my father, but I can't guarantee that the Moon Nation will send someone over. Then, thank you very much, Princess Barbara. Please inform the Moon Nation's king that the Norland continent will remember your kindness and is willing to provide some compensation for your help, Michael said with a smile. All right. Barbara nodded. Outside the city, at the peak of a stone mountain, Douglas looked at Elizabeth with a pitiful gaze and said, Elizabeth, you should already know that your father might not be around anymore. Come back with me. You're still a frost dragon after all. From the day I was brought away by Alex, I no longer thought that way. Elizabeth looked at Douglas expressionlessly. She did not hide the mockery in her eyes. I will go back, but not now, and not in such a pitiful state. Douglas frowned. He looked at Elizabeth, who was pursing her lips, and seemed to see the stubborn dragon youth from back then. Anyone can sit on the frost throne, but it will belong to me eventually. Let Fox go up and sit for a while. I will get back everything I've lost, Elizabeth said coldly. Then, she turned and took a step forward. The frost under her feet condensed into a huge snowflake, and she disappeared from the peak of the mountain. Douglas stood alone on the peak for a long time, but a gratified smile appeared on his face. This lass is indeed like Rankster. Since that's the case, I don't have to worry about Lewis poaching her. This child is still a frost dragon after all. Georgina saw the big guy who was stomping his feet under the stone statue with a big red flower in his hands from afar. He was wearing a loose and comfortable robe, which made his tall and round figure look even rounder. However, he looked very comfortable and relaxed. Chapter 1921. Harrison was indeed a little nervous. He already owned 3 factories that belonged to him, and he had been doing business with his father since young. He had a good business mind and experience in dealing with people. However, this was the first time he was going on a one-on-one date with a girl since he was born. His best friend was already carrying his 4th baby, and he was only taking the first step on a date. Take a deep breath. No problem. It's just going to look for food together. I'm good at this. Harrison took a deep breath and then exhaled a puff of white smoke. He then stomped his feet again. He had been standing here for more than an hour. It wasn't that Georgina had stood him up, but that he had come a little earlier than the agreed time. Well, it was only an hour and a half earlier. After all, it was his first time. He was worried that there would be some problems on the way, and if he didn't arrive on time, wouldn't he miss the appointment? When he arrived, he wanted to let himself get used to the environment and rehearse the lines that he had thought of last night, so he didn't stay in the carriage. An hour passed in the blink of an eye. When I see Georgina, I'll strike a handsome pose first, and then use a gentle and domineering tone to give her this flower. Then, I'll be a gentleman and invite her to look for food together. Yes, that's the procedure. First, Harrison paced around and mumbled softly. He looked very serious. Hello, Mr. Harrison. Just then, a voice sounded from behind Harrison.
Ah.
Harrison was shocked. He quickly turned around and saw Georgina, who had appeared behind him without him knowing when. He nodded helplessly and said, Hello, Miss Georgina. Georgina wasn't wearing the black shirt and pants that she had worn yesterday. Instead, she was wearing a grayish-white striped cotton dress with a black leather jacket on the outside. She had a pair of deerskin boots on her feet, and there was a circle of short hair around the edges of her shoes. Her face was small, and the hair that was let down covered half of her face. Her skin was a little pale, but she looked much better than yesterday. There was even a little bit of color on her face. After changing into a new set of clothes, she had the aura of a young girl. Her light purple eyes were also lively and lively. However, after changing out of her loose-fitting cotton-padded clothes, Georgina looked even more petite and thin. It was as if a strong gust of wind could blow her away, which made Harrison's heart ache. Georgina blushed as Harrison stared at her. Her fingers subconsciously grabbed the hem of her skirt, but she was feeling nervous and uneasy. Her cousin had picked out this outfit for her. After hearing that she had a date with Harrison, her cousin had specially brought her out to pick out this outfit and brought her to a hair salon to fix her hair, which hadn't been styled for 3 years. However, she still had no confidence. She knew that she had never been a pretty or cute girl, and she was afraid that Harrison would hate her when he saw her.
Now,
Georgina wanted to say something to break the silence. This is for you. Harrison held the big red flower with both hands and handed it over nervously. There was only one flower. It was a very common winter plum, but it was very fresh. There was still dew on the petals, as if it had just been plucked. Oh, it had indeed just been plucked. Georgina saw a winter plum tree not far away. It was in full bloom, but the tree was a little tall, so the flowers grew at the top. Thinking of Harrison's clumsy figure and the way he had to tiptoe to pick the flower, a smile appeared on Georgina's face, and she felt a little warm. Moreover, he was holding this flower and standing here for a long time, just to wait for her. What a wonderful feeling. In the past, she was the only one who would foolishly wait on the road for a figure that might pass by. She would give him the thing she treasured and cared about the most, only to have her dignity trampled on again and again. And now, someone was actually willing to wait for her here, and even give her flowers. I saw it just now when I came. I thought it was very beautiful, so I wanted to pluck one for you, Harrison explained with a smile. However, he didn't say that he was caught on the spot by the patrolling old man in the square when he was plucking the flower. He was only released after paying a fine of 100 copper coins. Thank you. Georgina received the flower, held it to her nose, and sniffed it. A smile bloomed on her face. It smells so good. Harrison immediately smiled like a 300-pound fatty. Georgina looked up at Harrison and asked, Then, where should we go now? Let's go look for all the famous snacks that are scattered around Chaos City in Cedar Alley now. Do you remember that snack stall that specializes in selling fried biscuits? They're only the size of a copper coin, but they're very crispy and sweet, Harrison said with a smile. Georgina's eyes lit up immediately. She nodded and said, I know. It's sold by a bald orc uncle. His biscuits are in all kinds of cute shapes, such as rabbits, turtles, and little fish. I loved them when I was young.
Yes.
His stall has been moved to Aiden Square now. I'll bring you to him. It's not far ahead, Harrison said as he pointed ahead. All right. Georgina nodded and turned to walk ahead expectantly. When Georgina turned around, Harrison slapped himself in the face and scolded himself in his heart. You're the best at thinking, but you're the worst at acting. He didn't do any of the poses that he had planned. He spoke like an idiot and behaved like a teenager who wasn't even 18 yet. His first experience in love was such a failure. He stole a glance at Georgina's side profile and was a little worried that his image in her heart would take a nosedive. Georgina was holding the flower with a smile on her face. Mr. Harrison still made people feel comfortable as usual. Although he was a little nervous, he was still so cute. Even the little duck embroidered on his chest was so cute. He was such a gentle person. The two of them walked forward with their own thoughts. After a while, Georgina suddenly stopped and turned to look at Harrison. Where's that shop? Harrison, who had been staring at the girl all the way, suddenly came back to his senses. He looked around and pointed to the back. It's in that alley. We seem to have walked past it a little. It was a small alley that was sandwiched between two luxurious restaurants. It looked very inconspicuous and was used by the people who lived behind the square to enter and exit. Georgina walked to the entrance of the alley and was greeted by a burst of noise. In the narrow alley, there were 10 odd snack stalls extending along the alley. Many customers were eating in front of the stalls, and the hawkers were calling out their wares. A familiar feeling washed over her. No pop-up window. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.